Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Iron Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had Revival Mutation Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Midoriya Izuku was dead. His blood was on the concrete, the summer evening heat oppressive enough that the spreading puddle seemed almost elastic. There was a gash, approximately a handspan in length, across his throat. His carotid was severed. His body was cooling. And he was dead. Only one person was there to witness his body, and they could do nothing but stand by in shock. Powerless for all of the pomp their quirk had given them. Frozen. That's why nobody seemed to notice as the world took a breath. A boy, under the thumb of his father, spared a glance at the sky, searching. Another, ridiculed for something out of his control, closed his eyes to finally relax. A girl's grip on a plank loosened, causing its weight to disappear. A hero, sitting with his brother, laughed in shock as his ever-studious sibling missed a question. A man looked up, away from his papers, quirk activating on instinct, while another's control slipped with a cloud of steam. The beeping of machines stuttered in a dark room. And Bakugo Katsuki could not look away from the corpse of his childhood friend. Something almost anxious buzzed in between the noise of the cicadas. Everything was focused on that one still body. Revolving around a scene only one person saw like the outcome would change everything. It did. The world did not lose a hero that day. Before everything went wrong. Izuku was excited. His best friend and future hero partner, Bakugo Katsuki's quirk had manifested in a series of tiny explosions. It was so fitting for his friend's personality. He wondered if his own quirk would be as on the nose. Your next Aizu, your quirk has to be at least half as cool as mine if you want a hero together, you know? I can't carry your weight if you turn out to be useless. Bakugo said, placing his now cooled hands on his hips and revealing his teeth in something like a smirk. Of course, Kaken, he replied, throwing his hands in the air as his eyes sparkled. He ignored the stinging in them. He had been holding Bakugo's hand when his quirk manifested. But he didn't mind, after all, his future hero partner would never use his quirk on him. He didn't envy villains for that. His small taste of an unrefined explosion had brought tears to his eyes, tears that he explained away as happy excitement for his friend. An easy explanation for someone who so often cried so he couldn't imagine taking a purposeful and well-trained hit and being all right. A proud smile stayed on his face all the way home, powered by the thought of their heroing duo. Every now and then it would make a reappearance, but it became rarer as time went on and his quirk didn't appear. It was gone by the time his mother took him to the doctor's office. "When are you going to get your quirk?" Bakugo snapped. And Izuku simply looked up at him from his notebook, where he had been transcribing information about Bakugo's quirk. His smile didn't drop, but it did dampen. He hadn't told Kaken what the doctor had said yet. It hadn't been long since Bakugo's explosions manifested, but it had been long enough for a marked change in his behavior. Friends became lackeys, and common courtesy became insulting. Izuku pretended it was okay. He thought it was okay. It wasn't okay. But Izuku didn't understand that at the time. After all, powerful quirks make things okay. That was the rule. It was the rule in heroics. Powerful quirks saved people. It was also the rule in escaping consequences. Powerful quirks were an excuse. A get-out-of-jail-free card. At this rate you're gonna end up a quirkless Deku. Izuku's heart sank, but he said nothing with a nod and laugh. Izuku was excited. Bakugo found out 4 weeks after he had. Izuku was honestly surprised he managed to hide it that long. It had been a long time coming, and Izuku was starting to suspect that, even if he had manifested a quirk, Bakugo wouldn't have treated him any better. He felt a sick sense of relief when he was pushed away and not burned. Bakugo had never burned him purposely, but his control slipped when he was angry. And he was angry. "You liar, how dare you try to trick me? Is that what you people do? Trick people more powerful than you and hang off of them like leeches?" And no, Kaken. The stutter was a semi-recent development, one of the things that appeared in place of his quirk. It was not a fair trade. "I wasn't trying to trick you, I swear." I didn't know what to say. It was partially true. After his mother had apologized to him, saying all the wrong words with all the best intentions, which hurt so much more, he had wondered if his dream was dead. He decided it wasn't not completely, but there was definitely a piece he didn't think could ever be revived. He could never be a hero next to Bakugo. Bakugo scoffed like he didn't believe him, saying more things that Izuku didn't want to hear, so he didn't hear. He just fixed his eyes on the ground and let the words wash over him, receding like the tides with incomprehensible whispers of noise and the ever-present background of static, before shoving him to the ground. Izuku fell a lot. He was clumsy, tripping over his shoes, over the ground, and over the air itself. He was used to the normal scrapes and bruises of childhood. But this was different. He let out a little whine when his hands scraped against the ground as he tried to catch himself. It felt like burning, like stinging and static. It shouldn't be hurt that badly. He was crying as Bakugo and the others left. He was glad they were gone, but the finality of it left an emptiness in him. Loneliness. It wasn't unfamiliar, since he felt during the days his mom's work ran long. He wondered if it was better to be around people who hurt him than nobody at all, and he settled on the former. His hands still hurt. They hurt a lot more than they had when he last fell, and even more than they had when Bakugo's quirk manifested. He started crying harder as he struggled to his feet and figured that maybe it hurt so much because it was his closest friend that pushed him, rather than anybody else or his own fallible feet. "I'm sorry, Izuku." The words played on repeat in his head sometimes. He heard them intermittently, paired with explosions and the ever-echoing insult of Deku. His hands had long since healed, but he swore he could still feel the sting. Things at school only got worse, and rather than getting used to it, every hit only hurt more than the last. There was an ever-present ache in his chest. It was there when he ate as much of his dinner as he could stomach. It was there when his mother told him she loved him with that sad, sad smile, and it was there when he watched videos of his hero on repeat. He didn't think it'd ever go away. In other news, a quirkless man has been abducted from Dash. The news reports droned on in the background, but Izuku didn't bother to look up, only flinching when he heard the word quirkless. His mother spared him a worried glance, and he pretended he didn't see her mouth open to say something, anything, because all he could think of was her voice and, "I'm sorry. Can you help me with this math problem?" he asked, tapping his pencil over exercise number 6 on the homework sheet. He didn't need her help with it. In fact, he'd written the answer to this problem 3 times already, all in various sizes and fonts. Honestly, it was the most benign form of punishment his classmates had for him. It was also the only form that Bakugo Fai not failed, never failed, didn't participate in. Bakugo was too smart and too prideful for a useless Deku to do his homework. In fact, if Bakugo had known about this, he would have stopped it. Because doing homework was useful, and assigning a use to Deku was equivalent to high treason in Bakugo's court. "Let me look at it," Inko offered, reaching for the page with slight hesitation before carefully drawing it over with a wave of her hand. Izuku focused his vision only on her, not the page floating across the table, idly, as if it did not know the weight it carried. He smiled when the paper reached her hand. After he was diagnosed, she hadn't used her quirk around him. It took his careful coaxing for her to finally start up again, and even then she only did it sometimes. He wouldn't deny the sting that came with it, since he could have, or even should have, had that same ability, but with all he knew about quirks, he knew not being able to use them was more painful than anything else. And he'd already caused his mother enough pain. The smile stayed as she carefully explained the problem, from start to finish, and it became a bit more genuine when she beamed at his correct answer. He hadn't needed her help. Tears came to his eyes, unbidden, and his mother noticed with a panicked look. "Izuku?" she asked, hands fluttering as small objects shifted towards her distress without her permission. "It was just a really difficult problem. I'm glad it's done," he replied, with the smile he reserved specifically for his mother, the only person in the world who cared about him. It was not a difficult problem. By the time elementary school was over, Izuku was convinced he was sick. Probably some fatal disease, or maybe one that wasn't fatal but would stay with him his entire life until he wished it were. He just couldn't understand why everything always hurt him so much. He would have asked his mom, but the thought of another trip to the hospital with her by his side and the doctor talking and the look on his mom's face and the growing emptiness and the space where his smile should have been, and he just couldn't handle it. But what was worse was that he wasn't sure if everyone hurt the same, and he was just too weak to handle the pains that everyone else seemed to brush off. They all seemed to think so. He could see it in Bakugu's sneer while tears slipped out when he fell. He could see it in the pitying looks some of his softer classmates sent him when he was hunched over in the schoolyard, gasping for the breath something as simple as a kick had stolen from him. He ended up looking up his symptoms on his mom's laptop in the middle of the night. Typing things asking why everything hurt so much, why that blank feeling in his chest only ever seemed to grow, whether or not he was dying. The general consensus was that it was him. He was the problem, rather than some obscure disease. There was nothing physically wrong that could explain away what he was feeling. And that only made him feel worse. In desperation, he pled for solutions in the search bar, for ways to fix himself. Site after site suggested talking to someone, they suggested medication and meditation, and ads for self-help books popped up in the margins of his search. He was crying when he shut the laptop, and his wrists ached, and nothing could be done. He retreated to his room and pulled the covers over his head and took shaking breaths that were too loud. What if his mom heard him and worried? He tried to trick himself when sleep failed to come, thinking that it wasn't so bad. If the only thing that was wrong was his outlook, then all he had to do was try harder. He could smile wider, even if his smiles already stretched his chapped lips to the point of bleeding, and he could cry less, or at least learn to hide his tears better. It was doable. He needed to work harder. After all, he could never be a hero if he couldn't get through something as small as this. He decided he'd start that night. It wasn't as easy as he hoped it would be to stem the flow of his tears, but once he did, he washed his face to hide the redness and blew his nose and painted a wide smile on his face that didn't look like a grimace at all. His mouth tasted like iron, but he ignored it, inspecting the dark circles under his eyes. Those would be easy enough to hide if he wanted. He was already skilled at covering up the mottled purple, green, and red hues left on his skin by the classmates he had disappointed, while the makeup his mother had thrown away when it got too old. He got back in his bed and ignored the familiar buildup of pressure behind his eyes now that he wasn't focused on any other task. A second before any treacherous tears could slip out, he sat up and grabbed a notebook from his shelf and filled it with unpolished sketches of heroes that he drew up from memory. The ache in his wrists returned quickly, as it tended to whenever he became hyper-focused on whatever task his pencil was undertaking. He quickly forgot all about his late-night inquiry and the subsequent breakdown. Izuku didn't cry that night, but he didn't sleep either. He entered the kitchen with a bright smile in the morning, but based on the look on his mom's face, he'd forgotten to delete his search history. On his first day of middle school, his mother told him she was signing him up for self-defense classes. She said nothing of the bullying that bordered on torture, only mentioned that she was worried because of the quirkless kidnappings. A disturbing number of people seemed to think that whoever was taking these people was doing the world a favor, and whenever Izuku thought of that, a shiver crawled down his spine, and the cold thought that things would be better off without him entered his head. It sounded like Bakugu, the world is better off without a quirkless Deku like you. So he pushed it to the back of his mind, where it echoed without actively being recalled, like most of the things Bakugu had said to him. He agreed to go, despite the fact that most self-defense classes involved quirks. It was permitted to use your quirk to defend yourself, after all. He figured the class would just be another instance of him being crushed by other, more powerful people. At least he'd gain more tolerance to the pain. He cried less now, but not as little as he would like. Maybe this could remedy that defect. He was supposed to attend the classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays after school. He didn't protest, but he thought it might have been too optimistic to assume he'd have time to be beaten both in and out of school and do the homework assignments of the classmates that remembered him from elementary school. His first day of school went well for all of 11 minutes. He'd entered his classroom slightly early, and the other early bird students had greeted him with nice smiles. He hadn't recognized any of them, and he couldn't be happier for that. The countdown started when he saw Bakugu in the schoolyard. He had been looking out the classroom window when he caught sight of him. Izuku could recognize that slouched walk from miles away. He ducked his head to rest it on the desk and avoid Bakugu's gaze if he happened to look up at the windows. To anyone else it would appear that he was simply tired. When the door to Izuku's classroom opened to reveal Bakugu, he froze. He didn't see Bakugu's roaming eyes land on him, nor the way his violent smirk that settled into his most common expression when dealing with Deku. He didn't hear the scoff when the teacher appeared to tell everyone to quiet down. He only vaguely registered the words written on the chalkboard, "Introduce yourself by name and quirk in order of your class numbers," but he very strongly registered the growing grin on Bakugu's face and the malicious looks sent his way by his lackeys. He was number 17, with no hope of going in the beginning and fading into obscurity as others with interesting quirks were introduced. As one of the last to go, he would be remembered. "Midoriya Izuku," he said shortly, and the teacher's brows furrowed. "And your quirk?" he prompted, causing Izuku to look away. "My introduction is done," Izuku said, softly enough that it didn't sound disrespectful and with enough remorse to sound apologetic. The whole class seemed to take a breath at the implication. And then Bakugo laughed and called him a useless Deku, and tears did not spring to his eyes, so he simply smiled his brightest smile and sat down and figured that maybe if he laughed along this time it would be better for everyone. Nobody approached him after that, at least not anybody new. The old threats from elementary school were renewed and there were new bruises on his skin, but at least they weren't burns. They were never burns. It seemed like that was the one line Bakugo Katsuki would not cross when it came to his one-time childhood friend Midoriya Izuku. Whether or not Izuku cried in the bathroom alone rather than eating his lovingly made lunch in the cafeteria, nobody would know except for him and the janitor replacing the already depleted rolls of toilet paper in the second stall. He was bruised before self-defense class started on Tuesday. There had yet to be any new offenders, but the other students were quick to turn away when they learned that he was quirkless. He couldn't blame them either. Everyone knew the consequences of incurring the wrath of the school's rising celebrity, Bakugo, and nobody was willing to face them. Sometimes he thinks that, in their place, he would turn a blind eye as well. He tries to sympathize with them, to cut off any growing resentments at the root, but he knows that he could never look away from somebody in trouble. Because heroes don't look away. Izuku knows Bakugo will become a hero, a powerful one if not a great one, because he doesn't look away. He doesn't look away from his goal of being number one, and he doesn't look away from the bruises on Izuku's skin. The others do. They hurt him and then look away as though their actions don't exist as long as they ignore their consequences. Bakugo isn't like that. He knows which marks are his, and he knows their effect on Izuku. It's good, Izuku thinks, because as a hero Bakugo will have to make hard decisions. He will have to know that not everybody can or should be saved. And he's learning that very quickly as he trips Izuku on his way down the stairs. Izuku smiles through the scrapes that feel more like third-degree burns than simple flesh wounds and pushes himself up, ignoring the pain in his surely twisted ankle. He casts a glance at Bakugo at the top of the stairs, and Bakugo's red glare does not waver. Izuku has to keep smiling because at least someone is looking. He scurries away, his back aching where the books in his backpack dug into it during his fall. He used to wonder if a hero would come save him from this treatment, and a long time ago he had stepped up for somebody else in his position. He wasn't a hero, but he was enough to take that boy's place. He knew he had to be realistic. Heroes don't come for things as small as this. They have a lot more important things to deal with. Yeah, he thinks, some people aren't worth being saved. By the time he made it to the class, he wasn't sure how much more he could take. His ankle had swollen, and the trek to the self-defense class was difficult enough without the added premonition that he was walking towards his doom. He was trying desperately to prepare himself for more of the same when he saw the sign outside of the building. Self-defense for non-physical quirk users. He blinked at the sign, uncomprehending, for a couple of minutes before a heavy hand fell on his shoulder. He would have flinched if he wasn't so paralyzed with fear. Maybe it was finally his time to be spirited away like all of those other quirkless people on the news. "You here for classes, kid?" a man asked, towering over Izuku as he did so, and Izuku did all he could to nod. "What's your name?" "Midoriya Izuku," he replied on instinct alone. "Oh, you must be the intelligence quirk," the man said, eyes full of realization as he beamed at Izuku. Izuku's mind blanked and he nodded again. He was sure this was his mother's doing, never mind the trouble she could get in for lying about a quirk. He was more worried than grateful. He could take a beating any day, but would his mom be able to handle the legal consequences of his lie? They weren't exactly well off, especially with his conspicuously absent father. The man seemed to sense his reticence and his tone changed as the volume of his voice dropped. At least, that's what we're going to tell the rest of the class. I owe Inko a favor, so we'll keep this between us. The man whispered and Izuku didn't react. Maybe this class wouldn't be as bad as he had thought it would be. The class was painless. He was new, so it was mostly introductions and sorting out any last-minute paperwork. He was supposed to participate in a simple round of sparring, but one of the other students had glanced at him, looked towards the instructor, and gestured towards his ankle. Izuku had been careful not to limp, so he immediately thought that it was some sort of injury or weakness analysis quirk, similar to Pixie Bob. But his excitement quickly turned to dread as he remembered the bruises and the fact that he would show up injured more often than not. This could be a problem. Izuku averted his gaze as the instructor glanced between two of his students. We have an odd number of people today, so you'll sit out since it's your first time here. Izuku nodded at the man's words and forced his eyes not to wander towards the boy who knew. He didn't know what the activation conditions were. They most likely had to do something with line of sight, but if he was lucky it was something he could avoid by being careful, like eye contact. At the very least, he was relieved that his ankle was never mentioned out loud. The next few self-defense classes were educational, with a fair amount of pain sprinkled in. It wasn't malicious this time, and that's the best he could have hoped for. He had spent the classes resolutely ignoring the analytic gaze of that boy in between sparring and move demonstrations. The boy had not told the instructor anything since the first day, and Izuku had walked in with a wrist that was near broken at one point, so Izuku was confident he had avoided the activation conditions. Either that or the boy recognized a lost cause and figured if Izuku sat out every time he came in injured, he would never be able to figure out to defend himself from the cause of those injuries. He was a surprisingly fast learner. Maybe the desperation to make the pain stop pushed him to progress at an unfathomable rate, or maybe it was the fact that his hollow dream of being a hero was slowly becoming more plausible as he became more competent. He could learn how to fight. He didn't know why he hadn't thought of it before. There were plenty of heroes who had non-physical quirks. He just had to work harder. Months went by, and he could successfully evade most attacks. He could even deliver counters, but he was too weak for them to be very effective. He thought he could make up for that, and his lack of quirk, with his analysis skills. His teacher never said anything that made him think otherwise. In fact, he praised him as though he were anybody else. Anybody with a quirk. Izuku couldn't be sure if it was part of keeping up the act for the class, or part of his favor to Inko, but he appreciated it regardless. It made him feel warm where previously there had been nothing. Like he did have a hope of being treated well, despite everything. He was almost caught up in this delusion when Bakugo appeared before him in the schoolyard. He had noticed the change in Izuku and, as though he could sense the beginnings of the thought, "I'm not useless," in his head, decided something needed to be done to put him back into his place. He opened with a right hook, like he always did, and Izuku saw it. He saw it and he knew exactly where he should grab to turn Bakugo's momentum against him and send him careening into the dirt. He was fast enough to do it, and Bakugo was predictable enough for him to escape after. It seemed like everything was in his favor, but as Bakugo's fist grew nearer to his face, he still did not move. He ended upon the ground with a black eye and a bruised stomach and the thought that maybe hard work wasn't enough. He continued improving in class, but his progress was slower. He still held on to his hope of being a hero. It was like grasping a constantly slipping thread, and even if he held it tightly enough for it to cut into his hands as it pulled away, he knew he was nearing the end. The string on his end only grew shorter, and the best he could do was momentarily halt it, never managing to reclaim even a centimeter of its length. Bakugo only grew crueler, his hits were harder and his jeers cut deeper. Still, he never burned him. At this point, it was more cruel than anything, because it made Izuku hope that things weren't as irreparable as they seemed, even if the beatings were worse. It got to the point where Izuku would lay on the ground, unable to move for minutes that stretched into hours without his consent. He lied to his mom more often, saying he visited his self-defense on days where he was unable to move until the sun had sunk below the horizon, and even resorted to buying his own makeup to cover up bruises that would peek out from under his sleeves and collar. He wasn't sure if his inability to resist was because he physically couldn't or because he mentally couldn't. If he were to believe those internet searches he had done so long ago, it was all in his head. He had his own phone now, and he could search up such things at his own discretion. But he never did, because he was scared that nothing would have changed since then. And that realization only made the ache worse. At the beginning of Izuku's third year of middle school, an article was released. A piece of propaganda sensationalizing the quirkless kidnappings to the point of poeticism. It was well written enough to draw the attention of many. And suddenly there was another target on Izuku's back. He had already been preyed upon by his classmates, and he would always have to worry about those quirkless kidnappings, but now he also had the violent anti-quirk sensationalists to watch out for on top of that. One of his fellow students in self-defense class had been attacked for being only a step above quirkless. Another student lauded the article, saying it was right and that the quirkless were sick and should be put out of their misery. The teacher, with a half glance at Izuku, had shut him up rather quickly, and then used him in a demonstration of a rather painful technique. Izuku wondered if he would agree with them if he had been born with a quirk. He thought he might, since Bakugo, who had been kind in his competitiveness, only turned quirkless into a curse after he manifested his and Izuku hadn't. His mother had cried when the article was first released, and told Izuku not to look when he tried to read it over her shoulder. He would have cried too, if the growing emptiness hadn't swallowed up his sorrow, along with whatever else was left of him, the moment he read the first sentence. Quirkless kidnappings picked up after the article, and nobody could tell if the original groups were taking an opportunity to stock up or if the influx of hate crimes against them was adding to the rate at which they went missing. He started carrying a knife to school after the article was released. It wasn't that he thought a passerby could identify him as quirkless with a wayward glance, but he wasn't naive enough to think that an organization systematically kidnapping quirkless people lacked someone with the power to analyze quirks or lack thereof, or at least one with X-ray vision that could single out his extra toe joint with 95% certainty of his quirklessness. He was mostly carrying the knife for his mother. He hardly cared what happened to him at this rate. His plans had always been hero or bust, and it seemed like he was one card away from going over. But his mom cared. She was probably the only one who cared. Weeks seemed to blend together. He did well in his classes, both academic and combat, and he walked down the streets in a daze of sorts. He was tired. Bakugo said something new in class one day. "You'd be better off dead." And Izuku hadn't thought of that before, not directly at least. Indirectly, he had often thought others would be better off if he was gone. He never specified gone as dead, but he supposed it fit. He smiled at Bakugo before heading out the door. At least he knew the upper limits now. Bakugo could never say anything to him worse than that, and he had handled it well. He was safe in his suffering, thinking that it couldn't get worse. It wasn't as though Bakugo could kill him himself, or even sell him out to an anti-quirkless group. He liked his Auntie Inko too much to rid the world of her useless Deku of a son. Izuku was deluding himself though. He thought it wouldn't affect him, and that things couldn't get worse from here. He ended up surprised. Because it somehow did. Bakugo began using the go-die approach to insults more often, and Izuku would be lying if he didn't give it some serious thought. But then his mother's face would appear in his mind's eye with the image of being a hero, and he'd let it go with an exhale and a strained smile. "Why haven't you killed yourself yet?" Bakugo asked after class. The other students, barring Bakugo's lackeys Tsubasa and Fingers, had rushed out the door with the teacher's dismissal. It was a familiar routine. The teacher always left too, leaving the four alone. The thread of hope that was fraying in his grip did something he hadn't expected then. It snapped. The remaining length, barely enough to grasp, lay in his hand. But at least it couldn't be pulled away by anyone else. If he wanted to get rid of it, he would have to drop it himself. His knife flashed when it took it out and pressed it against his wrist. Bakugo's lackeys looked shocked, but Bakugo did not look away. Izuku wasn't sure if he was testing himself, or if he was testing Bakugo. "I'll do it if you say it again." It wasn't supposed to come out as a threat, it was said with the intention of being a promise. "You won't." And as always, Bakugo took it as a challenge, as though Izuku hurting himself was a slight against his inflated pride. "I will." Izuku replies, pressing the blade down hard enough to draw blood. He's so focused on Bakugo that the pain of the cut barely hovers in the background. He wonders if maybe it hurts less because it's by choice, or Bakugo's answer is so important to him that everything else is secondary. "Then do it." Bakugo said, eyes hard, and Izuku's grip almost slipped. The lackeys gasped and exchanged nervous glances. Tsubasa even opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Izuku flipped the blade shut and pocketed it. "You should be more careful, Kaken. Someone else would have done it, and I don't think that would have gone over well on your application to UA." He knew it was the wrong thing to say as he said it, and that belief was reaffirmed by the familiar feeling of Bakugo's fist burying into his stomach. Later, when he stumbled home, he thought the injury that hurt most was definitely that tiny slice on his wrist. "It seems like two of you have decided to apply to UA. Good luck on your applications." Izuku almost flinched at that, but he was at least it wasn't his name that teacher said. "Who's the other one?" Bakugo growled from his seat, nitroglycerin sparking in his palms from irritation. Izuku wished he had a quirk that let him sink through the floorboards. Actually scratched that he wished he had any quirk. Even if it was something as paltry as changing his hair color. It was Midoriya-kun. The teacher responded thoughtlessly, but Izuku had to wonder if this was a subtle means of telling him not to try to rise past his station. He couldn't even get a fast food job as a quirkless person, so it was no wonder his teacher was trying to wring any unlikely aspirations out of him early. Izuku couldn't blame him. He just wanted his students to have realistic goals, after all. Bakugo didn't say anything as he turned the full force of his glare on Izuku. Izuku didn't say anything either. Nor did he excuse himself. He knew what would come at the end of the class. And he knew trying to escape would only make it worse for him in the long run. On his forms, he had written that he was applying to UA. He hadn't said a single thing about the heroics course. He honestly doubted they'd let him take the practical entrance exam, and even if they did, he figured it would be more suitable for flashier or combative quirks than subtle, non-combative quirks. He was fine with that. As long as he got into general education, he'd have everything he needed. Connections, materials, information. He could get all of it by attending UA, not just its heroics course. If he was competent enough, no one would dare turn him away. Especially with the growing presence of organized villain groups. Like the one. Snatching quirkless people. He'd written UA General Education course. But, of course, Bakugo wouldn't have that. Neither would his teacher, apparently. Bakugo didn't believe his words, even when they devolved into pleas at the memories of the sting of the last time. He slammed his superheated palms on Izuku's desk with an explosion that charred the surface and left the smell of something burning in the air. Izuku stopped pleading at that, expression resolving into some sort of detachment. It was easier than he thought it would be, especially since he was almost completely hollowed out. He wasn't afraid of Bakugo's palms as they sparked. He was far more scared of his cooled fists and the reinforced soles on his shoes. Izuku didn't even flinch as Bakugo snatched his hero analysis notebook. He did have to bite back tears when his hard work was burned, though. He was almost relieved when Bakugo tossed it out of the window into a small pond, putting out the smoldering pages. Water was a lesser threat to his notes than fire. The ink of his pens didn't run much with water. He knew because of late nights where the tears wouldn't stop and he'd write and write to get it out, but it wouldn't stop. And if you want to be a hero that badly, try taking a swan dive off of the roof and hoping for a quirk in your next life. Maybe he would. He was about to say it too, anything to make this stop, but then felt a weight come to a rest on his shoulder. He felt Bakugo's hand warm through his sleeve, and lifted his eyes up, off of the floor, away from the window his notebook had disappeared out of, and all the way to meet Bakugo's. He didn't know what Bakugo found when he looked at him, but he must have felt it to be a challenge. He smelled something burning before he felt it. And when he realized his shoulder was burning with Bakugo's still unrefined quirk, he couldn't stop the tears from filling his eyes. There was the line. And here was Bakugo. Ah, Izuku couldn't help but to think, he must really mean it this time. Bakugo left shortly after the burn, and Izuku did everything he could not to glance at his ruined uniform as his arm throbbed and he gathered his things. He slung the backpack over his left shoulder, the unafflicted one, because he was already having to bite his lips and clench his fists to focus through the pain in his shoulder, and adding to that discomfort seemed like a mistake. He made his way awkwardly to the schoolyard. He felt off balance, and the reason for that didn't solely relate to the heavy backpack that had him tilting for equilibrium. Bakugo's quirk was loud, and his right ear was still ringing. He wondered if the noise would affect Bakugo one day too. He hoped not, as he fished his notebook out of the pond. It was salvageable, and he could always transfer the information to a new book if he needed to. He couldn't help but feel a bit bitter as his eyes fell upon a sketch of the waterhorse duo that took him ages to complete. At least the water stains seemed sort of intentional due to the nature of their quirks. He was mostly worried about getting home and dealing with the aftermath of the day. His mom worked late tonight, and he had a spare uniform. He could hide this too. But he would be skipping his self-defense class to do it, and surely his mom would notice that. He just didn't have the energy for fighting, and he didn't have the energy to avoid the ever-knowing eyes of his fellow trainee. He decided to text the teacher, saying he had flubbed some of his application forms and had to rewrite them as soon as possible. His apologies for missing class and rambling excuses made the text extra long, as they usually were. His mumbling was omniscient in that way. He fiddled with his phone as he walked through an underpass, waiting for a response anxiously. He didn't want to disappoint one of the only people who knew him to be quirkless and treated him well. "That's fine, good luck on your applications, kid." Izuku took a deep breath at the text, meaning to exhale through his nose to calm down, when something blocked his airway and covered his eyes. His phone went flying across the tunnel as his left hand snapped towards his pocket for his knife. It was awkward to reach across his body for it, but he couldn't move his right arm, especially with the new pressure on it that seemed to focus entirely on the weak point of his burn. Now kid, it'll only hurt for a moment. I just need your body," a voice said, but he couldn't see and he couldn't breathe, so he just stabbed the knife backwards. There was very resistance and he struggled to open his eyes. Everything was green. A murky, vaguely transparent shade of sewer. Now that he was aware of the connection, he found that whatever was being shoved down his nose and throat with a stinging vengeance also had a distinct taste of rot and grime. "Stop struggling," the voice hissed as Izuku continued to search for anything that he knife could catch onto for long enough to run away. He couldn't turn his head, but he knew that his backpack and its contents were somewhere on the tunnel floor. Of course, that meant nothing to him with his limited reach. He wondered if this was it. If countless other quirkless people had been taken this way, or if he just happened to be in the way of some unaffiliated villain. He supposed it wouldn't matter much once he had died anyways. He wondered if those taken quirkless people felt the same way he did now. Resigned. And maybe a bit relieved. His consciousness was fading. And all he could do was feel a sick sense of gratitude for the fact that it wasn't just him. The knife fell from his grip, blade catching his palm on the way down, but the sting of that was nothing compared to the burning of his lungs demanding oxygen they could not have as slime filled them up. And then there was nothing except the sound of rushing wind in the distance and a choked scream. He woke up to a slap in the face. It hurt enough to make him gasp, but he could tell it was done with the intention of lightly waking him up. He figured out why it hurt so much when he opened his eyes to find the number one hero before him. He could have analyzed his outfit, or the way his eyes seemed more shaded in person, or the fact that he was carrying slime in soda bottles. How did he manage to gather up the slime and put it in there? Or the fact that he was not as dead as he thought he would be, and that tinge in his chest that didn't feel like physical pain was maybe disappointment, or the way his smile seemed painted on rather than genuine. But there was only one thing that stuck out among his torrent of thoughts. Autograph. Izuku scrambled to pick up his still burnt and still soggy notebook and a pen before offering it to All Might. "See, could I have your autograph? You're my favorite hero ever. How did you manage to gather up the slime? Why were you chasing him? Is he related to the group kidnapping quirkless people? Also one question at a time, my boy." All Might's voice was loud, but it seemed more amused than annoyed, so Izuku did his best not to flinch as the notebook pages trembled in his grip. I already signed your book, see? He said, flipping a couple of pages to reveal a huge signature and a doodle of his famous hairstyle. When did he have time for that between gathering up the slime villain and waking Izuku up? Oh my god. Thank you so much. Izuku's eyes were shining, but not with sorrow as he looked at his hero. Do you mind if I ask you some questions? It wasn't any of the questions he had asked earlier. In fact, the question he had was very specific and very pressing. I'm afraid I'm a bit short on time today. All Might said, walking to the end of the tunnel. I must take my leave. I'll wait. Izuku called, but All Might was already in position to jump. All Might's jumping was more like flying and just as fast, but Izuku ignored the voice in his head telling him to stop before he got killed. It sounded like his mother, and latched onto All Might's leg at the moment of takeoff. He was almost thrown off at the every start, but managed to latch on with all of his strength and avoid certain death. Izuku wasn't sure how much more his shoulder could take by the time All Might noticed his extra passenger. Let go, All Might said in his fluster, and Izuku didn't have time to consider his hero intentionally or not asking him to willingly fall 300 meters to reach the ground before blurting out, if I let go I'll fall. All Might react quickly to that, regaining some sense and grabbing onto Izuku in case his grip failed during the descent. All Might landed gracefully on the top of a building, but Izuku ended up becoming dislodged and tumbling head over heels across the roof. He had just righted himself when a cloud of steam obscured his view, leaving a skeletal blonde man in All Might's place. He was wearing the same clothes as All Might, except now they hung off his frame as though he were a clothesline rather than a person. He was still tall though, at least 7 feet. The kind of tall that towers. A temporary physical enhancement type quirk? Izuku muttered to himself, considering the gaunt man before him. It would make sense, explaining away the reason All Might dodged questions about his quirk. If he had a built-in time limit on his strength, that would be regarded as a huge weakness that villains would exploit at every opportunity. But that he had been on missions that had lasted days before. Surely the time limit would have hindered him then? It'd be hard to hide, especially with the press. Unless it was a new development. All Might wasn't exactly young anymore, but such developments to his quirks so late in life seemed improbable. All Might seemed to be regarding him intently, and that's when Izuku realized the words must have slipped out in the form of incomprehensible muttering. He must have looked like a lunatic in front of his favorite hero. He didn't like that thought much. He shook it off physically, wincing when he jarred his shoulder, and smiled. I won't tell. He figured reassurance should come before his question. This were a huge secret that put All Might in danger, after all. If Izuku were lucky, which he would admit he often wasn't, maybe All Might would also explain the situation in person. He couldn't help but be curious about it. All Might visibly relaxed at his promise and sighed. This isn't a part of my quirk. Izuku's eyes widened and his face reddened at the implication that All Might had heard his ramblings. Bakugo always told him it was annoying. What if he had irritated the #1 hero, the most patient and forgiving person in Japan? It seemed unlikely that anybody but him would be able to pull such a feat off. Oh, was all he replied, fixing his gaze on the cement roof, waiting for All Might to say something. Even if it was scolding him for his odd habits or putting himself into danger for his fanboy tendencies. I was injured in a battle with a villain 5 years ago. Half of my internal organs were destroyed and I was reduced to this. I can only access my hero form for a few hours a day. It's kind of like flexing a muscle. Izuku ignored the last part, as intriguing as it was, and focused on the first statement. All Might had been injured in fights 5 years ago, but none on this level. Not to mention the recovery time that the fight would have had to occur around the time he faced off against Toxic Chainsaw, but not Toxic Chainsaw. The marks don't match the quirks. Izuku frowned. This meant the timeline didn't match either, and he didn't know what to make of that. All Might sighed as though he didn't know why he was still surprised at this boy's level of knowledge. The fight wasn't publicized. I'll be appreciating your discretion. All Might looked towards Izuku for more confirmation. Izuku nodded, reaffirming his earlier statement with a strong, of course. He didn't even stutter as he said it. But he did stutter as he asked the question that had been on his mind since All Might's interview when he declared anyone could be a hero. Can someone without a quirk be a hero too? He asked, and All Might's face set into a frown as a precognitive dread curdled Izuku's insides. No. Heroes with powerful quirks are irreparably injured all the time. It's too dangerous of a job for someone without a quirk. He replied, and Izuku stopped breathing, only for All Might to deliver a final line that he had probably meant to be comforting but was anything but, "It's good to have dreams, but you have to be realistic. You could always get a job as a cop or a doctor. They're heroes in their own right." And then he left the roof, leaving Izuku alone. Izuku was so tired as he glanced at the drooping sun from the rooftop. He didn't know where in the Muzutafu he was, so he figured he should get a bit closer to the edge to orient himself. A single sentence echoed in his ears as he surveyed the city from behind the roof's guardrail. "Try taking a swan dive off of the roof," a voice said, and his whole body throbbed like a dull headache in time with the ache in his shoulder. "It's fine," he thought, walking closer to the edge of the roof. "I'm just looking." He glanced over the city as he climbed over the low guardrail, shoe catching as he did so. "It's not like I'm going to jump." He stepped a little closer to the edge, glancing down as he walked along it. There weren't any people around and he was so I'm not jumping, he interrupted himself, a bit more firmly than before. He stayed on the edge for a moment, contemplating. The sun was about to set. His mom's face flashed in his mind. And then he turned away. "I won't dash," his foot slipped. He thought it was an accident until he woke up disappointed. His lungs just barely managed to stutter back to life as he opened his eyes to unbearable pain. He was lying in something warm, and he could barely think with the slitting migraine behind his eyes. His vision was doubled as he gazed at the stars. He had the fleeting feeling that more time had passed than he had thought as he recalled an image of the sunset from the rooftop. It was only thanks to his built-up tolerance from years of near torture that he was able to push himself up without doubling over from the blinding pain. His chest felt too hot and his fingertips too cold, and every inch felt like it was being compressed at an agonizingly slow, yet unforgiving rate. The world spun around him as he stumbled to his feet, hands slipping as he tried to steady himself on the slick ground. His shoulder still stung, but when he turned to look at it, the burn was gone. He stared for a few moments, uncomprehending, before his gaze caught on the red on his hands and trailed down to the puddle that lay where he lay. Izuku looked from the puddle to the rooftop, where a single red shoe of a matching shade peeked out at him from over the edge. He looked down to find himself covered in blood, but as he carefully checked, there was no source. Maybe he was in shock, he thought, glancing at the emergency exit that probably led to stairs. He tested the door and found it unlocked, quickly climbing flight after flight of stairs until he was back on the rooftop. He gathered his stuff and left quickly. He needed to get home and clean off before his mother could find him in such a state. He could think about what happened and the implications later. He felt empty as he did all of this, as though he was going through a predetermined set of motions. He wondered if it mattered now. He was probably in shock. Izuku was glad that his mom wasn't home yet. It was a familiar, yet unfamiliar, feeling. Usually he was just relieved when she wasn't there to observe his state, but also a bit cold. Lonely, proud. This time he was only grateful. He didn't want her to see him like this. He wasn't sure he ever wanted anyone to see him like this. His school uniform was still burnt at the shoulder, but now it was torn in a few places that didn't quite make sense. It could have been the aftermath of the slime incident, but he thought it was more likely to be from the fall, based on the stains that seemed to spread out across the uniform despite the skin beneath it being intact. His hands were sticky where the blood had congealed, but parts had dried, causing browned flakes to float to the ground when he stretched his fingers. The pressure behind its eyes was painful enough to stall his thinking. If he had been in the right state of mind, he would have been thankful for it. His dark green hair had been matted into a brown, and all of the blood made him think that, maybe he should check the rest of the apartment and clean up any stains he may have left when he entered. But first he'd have to clean up. He didn't bother to take his uniform off or wait for the shower to heat up. He started with his hair, washing it as many times as it took to remove its impromptu dye. He didn't find any cuts or injuries on his head as he did it, and even if he did, he wouldn't be able to claim those as the source of the blood. He was still breathing after all. He recalled the scene as the shower's spray changed from clear to red to pink. It wasn't anything particularly interesting, a puddle of blood too big to imply anything less than fatal injury. Some chunks of something grayish-pink gore splattered across the stained pavement. He distantly wondered if it was brain matter. He decided his uniform was not salvageable and threw it in the dumpsters behind his apartment after he finished checking the floor and door handles for signs he'd passed by. It was a good thing he checked. The sight of a bloody handprint on her front door would have shocked his mother into retirement. The ache in his head was replaced by curiosity as he settled under the covers of his bed. He eyed the knife he'd placed on the nightstand, and then his gaze danced over to the still steamy bathroom. He snatched the knife and headed into the bathroom with half a second of thought. He'd have to try it again sometime to confirm, anyways. And if the result was different, he wasn't sure he'd be in any state to complain. There was a 5% chance. He was playing Russian roulette with 20 chambers, but 19 were already filled. Izuku draped himself over the edge of the bathtub, pulling a sleeve up to expose his arm and placing the knife in an almost familiar position. He held it the same way he had when he had spoken to Bakugo, with no semblance of the skill he had learned in his self-defense class's weapon unit. The knife hovered above his skin, and he was ready to push it in and drag it down, splitting his skin until his elbow, when he heard the front door open. He dropped the knife. "I'm home," Inko called, quietly enough to not wake her son if he had been sleeping. Izuku appeared in the entryway in front of her, a smile on his face and his arms clasped behind his back. "Welcome home." She smiled. Izuku saw Bakugo on the news before school that day. He did not see Bakugo in class. The scene of Bakugo struggling against the slime villain, while others looked on, was burned into his retinas. How many times had he been in that same position, waiting for a hero that wouldn't come? It had been on the same route he took home, only when he had walked through, it was so many hours after the incident had occurred that not even crime scene tape remained. He had an inkling that it was his fault. He must have knocked the slime monster out of All Might's grip when he latched onto him. He should have been there. The news echoed in the background as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had almost gotten Bakugo killed for a question that he hadn't actually wanted to hear the answer to, and the news anchor wouldn't let him forget it. Nor the other event, he realized, as he tuned back into what was being said mid-sentence, that investigating a death that could have been a possible suicide, but no body was found. He turned off the TV at that. He had been thoughtless. He went to visit Bakugo during the weekend, figuring he could use some time to himself. The news said he wasn't badly injured, but he wasn't unscathed either. Mitsuki let Izuku in with a smile that was sharp like Bakugo's, but less malicious. Their parents never got the memo that the status of childhood friends had changed. Izuku was quick to invite Bakugo on a walk for fresh air. Bakugo only glared at him until they got outside, but he still followed. His arms were bandaged, and one was in a sling. Probably a symptom of quirk overuse. "You here to gloat?" Bakugo asked as soon as they were far enough away from his house for the echoes of his growling shouts to die before reaching his parents' ears. Izuku was not there to gloat. In fact, he had been worried. He supposed it was foolish of him to think Bakugo would understand his perspective now. "I just wanted to let you know that I took your advice." His smile was a bit more twisted than he had originally intended, and Bakugo's expression twitched for barely a moment. "What advice would I give a med nerd like you?" "Oh, you know," Izuku said airily, adding in a leisurely hand movement that stretched the scratch on the side of his wrist with a jolt of pain, "the whole, take a swan dive for a quirk suggestion." Bakugo's eyes narrowed and he let out an audible growl at that. "What does that mean?" He was a question that was spoken like a demand. Izuku just smiled wider. "I'll show you." And then he took his knife out and slit his throat before Bakugo could say a single word more. The day was hot as Bakugo watched the corpse of his childhood friend. He didn't know what to do. Who to call? He had never expected this, never even considered it. Maybe he should have, especially since, as Deku said, he had pushed him towards it with his advice. That wasn't this all his fault? No, he reasoned, he hadn't been the one to slit his childhood friend's throat. But you might as well have been. A voice whispered. And it sounded like Deku. He glanced at the body, and then at the slowly spreading puddle of blood, and then he threw up. He made sure to turn away from the body as he did so. Even he wouldn't desecrate a corpse. When he turned back, Deku was sitting up, staring directly at him. Bakugo thought it must have been a hallucination of guilt or shock or even a mirage under the summer sun. And then he stood up, grabbing the knife and slipping it into his pocket with a very Deku-like smile. Bakugo wasn't even angry. "It's a nice quirk, isn't it?" Izuku asked the stunned Bakugo. "I never would have found it without your help." He left without another word, turning sharply into an alley and weaving through a few others, just in case Bakugo tried to chase after him, before arriving at the place where he had left a water bottle and change of clothes. This was the confirmation he'd been looking for. He had a quirk. He ignored his supplies and leaned against the wall, roughly sliding to the ground. But he couldn't help but to think of Bakugo's expression when he said what he did. He'd never seen that face on his childhood friend before. Perhaps it had been a bit cruel of him to say that, he thought as he curled up in the corner of an alley, gasping at the pain in his throat. He was pretty sure he wouldn't be able to eat solid things for a while. Even though Bakugo helped, he would have discovered his quirk sooner than later regardless. After all, everyone had thought he was quirkless. Izuku bought a new notebook and, after some thought, titled it, "My Quirk Analysis." And then he thought of the implications of his quirk and scratched out the "my." He didn't think he knew enough to name his quirk, so he just wrote out a rough description: regeneration of the body in fatal or near-fatal situations. He was pretty sure death was the trigger, but it was possible the trigger was nearly dying, and he wasn't sure he had a way to test without worrying his mother. Izuku also knew enough to conclude that the regeneration affected all of his injuries, not just the fatal ones, from the healed burn on his shoulder. He wished he had access to some imaging machines, so he could check to see if any signs of damage remained. But he didn't, so he just sighed and absent-mindedly drew his pencil up and down on the corner of the page, graying out an area of the paper. He should be able to test everything he needed out during the break between his last year of middle school and first year of high school. Izuku was excited, a familiar feeling from his childhood when it came to quirks. But he couldn't help but be frustrated at his lack of information. Whenever he wrote about hero quirks, there was always plenty of data to sift through and draw conclusions from. He only had 2 instances of quirk use to draw data from, and he hadn't been in the right state of mind for either of them. It would also prepare him for the UA entrance exam. He was still planning on sticking to the general education plan, since his quirk wasn't a flashy emitter type, but he could always try to apply through the heroics course just to see what would happen. Who knows, he might get to see some amazing quirks. He asked his mother for a watch that could monitor his physical condition and sync with his phone as a present for graduating middle school. He said it would be helpful to the exercises he was planning to pick up. He was fast and had techniques for defending himself, but he needed a bit of muscle to learn effective attacks. He didn't exactly know how to teach himself fighting, but he knew he would have to. Although all heroes don't exclusively specialize in combat, they have to be able to defend themselves and citizens when the situation calls for it. And he wasn't confident in his ability to do that. Izuku's mother worked most days, so, when he found he had the house to himself, he decided to get started on his training. He didn't really know if what he was about to do could be called that, but he decided to dub it as such anyways. He had recently found a good spot to practice his quirk, which he couldn't exactly do at home, so he grabbed his backpack with his newest notebook and his knife and left. Dagoba Beach was a trash dump, and nobody came near it, not even villains, so he thought it was perfect. He had considered searching out abandoned buildings in the seedier parts of the city, but he wasn't interested in getting kidnapped. That's all they could do to him now, he realized, now that death wasn't an option, but then again there are some things worse than death that he'd like to avoid. It smelled bad, but he did his best to ignore it as he weaved through the rubbish to find a relatively hidden area before clearing out the trash there. It was something akin to a secret base, Izuku decided, laying on the sand as he tried to catch his breath and stem the flow of sweat down his temples. Moving the trash to make space was more work than he had thought it would be, but it gave him a good idea of how to increase his muscle mass, so he took it in stride. He had arrived early in the morning, but now it was mid-afternoon. He wasn't sure if he would have enough time to do what he originally came for, so he texted his mother to ask how work was going. Her reply said she'd be home late. He had time. He wasn't sure if it was apprehension or excitement that washed over him as he drew his knife, flipping open the blade. It gleamed in the sunlight. He had been careful to clean it after his talk with Bakugo. He'd grown attached to it in a twisted way and needed to take care of it. He set a timer, pressing start and subsequently slitting open one of his wrists. It'd take longer, but he wanted to make sure the heart rate monitor properly recorded his information, which it might not be able to do if the wrist it was on was cut. He didn't hesitate, even though he wanted to, because he needed the data of how long it took to die and revive to be as accurate as possible. He also needed to know if he did die, or if his quirk kicked in before his heart stopped. Izuku lay on his side, his bleeding arm as far away from him as possible. He'd brought extra clothes, but he didn't necessarily want to have to use them. His arm burned as he watched his blood seep into the sand, making an almost muddy mixture. Or maybe his blurred vision was only making him think it looked muddy. He felt a bit lightheaded. His arm was warm, but he was cold at the edges. His breaths came out more like sighs and everything spun into darker and darker iterations of themselves before fading entirely. Or maybe he had just shut his eyes. Even his eyes opened again, his arm was burning as though he had just cut it. He grabbed a water bottle from his bag, pouring a bit on his arm to clear off the remaining blood, and found clear, unmarred skin. He sat up, careful of his right arm, which tingled with pain and wouldn't respond properly to his calls for movement, before kicking at the blood-stained sand to half-heartedly bury it. It didn't really matter what people found in this dump of a place anyways. Izuku was quick to grab his phone, jotting down a note about the pain of his injuries lingering after they had healed, and checking the heart rate data, and confirming that it had been at 0. He noted, with a bit of surprise, that the restart of his heart was almost instantaneous from his moment of death. The process really hadn't taken long. The most lengthy part was spent passed out and bleeding. It confirmed that he needed to die for the quirk to activate at least. Maybe the time it takes to wake up relates to the extent of the injury? He considered, recalling how falling from the roof had taken hours while bleeding out was settled in minutes. It made him wonder if a simple, instantaneous death would have an instantaneous regeneration. He also wondered what would happen if his body was completely destroyed. By the time he got home, he had enough relevant information on his quirk to fill half a page and had enough questions to fill 3. It wasn't as productive as he thought it would be. But that may be because he only had a knife. There were a lot of ways to die in this world. It was only fair that he should try a few more out. Despite his enthusiasm, it was decidedly hard to think of different ways to test his quirk. Scratch that it wasn't hard to think of them, it was hard to put them into practice in a safe, as ironic as that was, way. He considered drowning himself in the ocean, but was too worried about getting swept away. He also didn't want to test it out in his bathtub. He wasn't exactly superstitious, but he didn't like the thought of dying in his own house. Maybe it was because his mom lived there too and he wanted to keep her as far away from this as possible. He couldn't be a hero if he hurt her in the process. He spent his days split between moving trash to gain strength and the occasional quirk test. His current test was going to take a while. He'd set aside a couple of weeks to test how far back auxiliary injuries were healed. Every day at the same time, he cut a tally mark into his arm and he'd see how many days disappeared when he performed his next test. He also made sure to note the bruises he got from carrying the trash around the beach and the days he got them. That'd be helpful to his research. On the last day, he made marks every hour, then every 30 minutes. Starting at the 10-minute countdown, every 60 seconds was punctuated by a slice. It hurt a lot, but he needed to determine if his body was going back in time or if he was being healed, and ways to test that information were pretty limited with his lack of resources. He was careful to make the cuts shallow. If he lost too much blood and fainted, he wouldn't be able to properly carry out his test, wasting weeks of preparation. He was relieved when the 10 minutes were up and he could finally test his theory. His usual ritual was quick, hesitation growing less and less common as he got more and more used to the process. He had noticed it was taking more time to bleed out lately, and he wondered if that had something to do with his quirk or if he had been inconsistent. He was definitely getting more used to the tingling feeling in his arm afterwards, and was able to move it almost immediately after waking up. That's progress. He thought blearily as his eyes slipped shut, blocking out the image of a spinning world. When Izuku opened his eyes, all of the cuts that had yet to scar over had disappeared, leaving him fine red lines near his elbow, where the oldest cuts were made. Most of the bruises were gone too, some of which had been older than a few lasting scars, meaning his quirk wasn't time-dependent. "Healed injuries do not regenerate," he wrote, wincing a little as he flexed his fingers to adjust the grip on his pencil. When he reread the sentence, it seemed painfully obvious, so he added, "It seems likely that injuries that are healing may not regenerate depending on how far along they are in the process, and that if a limb were to be amputated, it could probably grow back as long as the injury had yet to start healing." He glanced at his pinky toe as he wrote that, too curious for his own good. "Can I regenerate limbs?" He asked the air, and the only response was the rushing of waves at the edge of his beach. It turned out he could. Inko was starting to worry about her son. She wasn't home very often, but she had the feeling that he was home even less so. She couldn't explain it, exactly, but there was a feeling that their once warm home was a little less lived in than before. She wasn't sure she could ask him about it. He had stopped going to self-defense classes at some point, but that wasn't what stuck out to her. He had learned what he needed. It made sense that he would stop. What stuck out to her was something a lot more subtle. It was in the way his smile traded its joyous cadence for an almost animal edge and its forced reassurance for something a lot more genuine. She knew Izuku wanted to be a hero. She knew he thought about it all of the time, and that he was prepared to do anything to get there. But she also knew that his efforts had been directionless. Like he hadn't known what to do with himself to start bridging the gap between quirkless and hero. She certainly couldn't blame him for that either, since she hadn't known where to start as his mother. It was her job to help him, and she knew she hadn't, not enough. She wouldn't say his efforts were misguided. But it seemed like they had a direction now, and she couldn't be sure it was a direction she liked. She liked the genuinity in his expression. But it was the other part that worried her. Her heart told her something was wrong, while Izuku seemed to tell her everything was right. But that was fine. She could bear those changes and this worry, as long as it made him happy. Izuku became something of a vigilante. It was accidental more than anything. He had been on the hunt for quirks, something he had always liked to do, but this time it was night. And he was in a shady part of town where the buildings were tall enough to block out the sky despite their dilapidated walls and the odd stains upon them. Objectively, it was a bad idea for Izuku to be there. Subjectively, it was still a bad idea. How bad of an idea, exactly, had not struck him until he found himself in an alley with two men, one of which was on the receiving end of a knife. He approached the situation quietly, figuring he could be a distraction for the man being mugged to escape. He was quick to knock the knife out of the mugger's hands, not even wincing when the victim ran out of the alley without a glance at his alleged savior. That was how these things tended to go. "Who are you?" the man asked roughly, a crazed grin settling on his face. Izuku decided the smile was more unnerving than anger, but he didn't say anything, afraid he'd betray too many details about himself to be safe. He was glad for his too big hoodie since it obscured both his frame and his face. "Not gonna answer, huh?" The smile widened, and the man moved to grab him, but he easily dodged. He couldn't exactly fight back, but at least he wasn't a stationary target. Everything was going surprisingly well until the man's nails caught the skin of his wrist when he had tried to deflect a blow. He didn't think anything of it at first, despite being hyper-aware of the tearing sensation and painful warmth of his newly exposed skin. "I've got you now," the man sang, and Izuku was quick to back away, pressing himself up against the wall. It was probably the man's quirk. His activation conditions were met, and Izuku was almost certain it had something to do with the growing numbness in his arm. "A paralytic?" he asked under his breath, mind racing as he considered his options. He considered pulling out his knife for a moment. It would be a good opportunity to learn his quirk's efficacy against poisons and non-physical factors. But he couldn't do it right now. His quirk was not the kind that should be advertised. Its utility would definitely drop the moment people learned the trick to it, and he'd become much easier to counteract in a fight. He didn't have a subtle enough way of triggering his quirk at this point. He should look into that. Oh, you got it. The man sounded surprised. I'll give you the antidote if you cooperate, kiddo. Either that or you let it spread to your lungs and heart. I'm sure you can guess what happens then. Izuku could have guessed, but he didn't think the man would agree with his prediction. He was pretty pleased the man explained his quirk to him free of charge though. Now he wouldn't have to piece together half-baked information later for his notebook. At this point, the man assumed he all but won over Izuku. His quirk spread quickly, and, since Izuku was small, it wouldn't be long until he was on the floor gasping for breath his lungs could not take. Unluckily for the man, Izuku had grown used to moving while his limbs were numbed with pain. That's why he was surprised when Izuku's arms snapped up to box him on the ear. There wasn't a lot of force behind it, but it was enough to damage his balance. That's all the opportunity Izuku needed to sweep his feet out from under him. Once the man was prone, he didn't stand a chance. A swift kick to the temple knocked him out, and Izuku, although Izuku's arm no longer listened to him, he had another arm. It was all too easy to draw the blade across his neck. He was dead in seconds, and up within a minute. Slitting his throat was one of his messiest deep quirk activations. But it was the fastest and the one with the least consequence. His neck may hurt, but he could still move normally. The only thing that changed was talking less and eating softer foods for a few days. Ice cream really wasn't much of a punishment, he decided, resolutely avoiding glancing down at the stain on his hoodie. He'd get it out with hydrogen peroxide later. He inspected the man's fingernails. He wasn't surprised to find the ones he was scratched with were an inhuman purple color that couldn't be explained by nail polish. Izuku cut his nails carefully, deciding to keep them. He could use them to get more data on how poison affected him. It seemed like it was combated by his quirk, but he couldn't be too sure. The man might have been bluffing when he implied the poison was fatal. Izuku could fact-check that easily. He also cut the nails on his left hand, which he assumed provided the antidote. He wondered if the man could control the concentration of his toxin. Izuku regretted not asking for a name. He could have looked him up in the quirk registry after he was arrested with that. All criminal quirks were made public knowledge. Izuku didn't really know what to do with the man at this point, but he knew he couldn't carry him to the police station. Nor could he tell the police he had knocked out a mugger to save someone. They'd arrest him for vigilantism. That's what this was, wasn't it? Izuku signed with a frown, using the man's own jacket and materials around the alley to tie him up and lean him against a wall. He also left one of the nails from each hand with a quick note written with his non-dominant hand about them, just in case an officer got poisoned and needed the cure. Izuku took his hoodie off after exiting the alley. He didn't have any other clothing to wear, and some of the blood had seeped into his t-shirt, but luckily the t-shirt was dark enough for it to be mistaken as the sign of a spilled drink. He grabbed the first payphone he found, not bothering to insert coins since he knew emergency calls were free, and gathered up every bit of distress he could. He didn't have to try too hard, since his voice was already rough from his quirk. I saw a man getting mugged in an alley in East Mizudafu by the electrical building. I don't know what will happen to him, please get there soon. The guy had a knife dash. He certainly sounded like he was crying when he said all of this, but his eyes were dry. And his mouth was set in a straight line. It was the opposite of his elementary school self, constantly trying to sound unafflicted while his expression betrayed him. He had changed a lot. The officers promised to get there soon, and told him to stay put, but he was gone before they asked him to hang up. Izuku decided to avoid the news. He couldn't help the anxiety creeping up his throat whenever he thought of the trouble he'd be in if he was caught. He could always claim self-defense. After all, vigilantism is defined as unlicensed quirk use. He was registered as quirkless. But despite that, he figured getting caught would foil his plans to attend UA. That didn't stop him from indulging his quirk curiosity, though. He ended to be prepared for anything to be a hero, and he had a later start with his quirk than most, so he had to do everything he could while he could to catch up. And everything included night walks in dangerous places where villains roamed free, searching for victims. He learned a lot of new things by playing the victim, and he managed to turn a few small fry into the police in the process. It was always accidental. Whenever he managed to knock them out with a lucky hit, he was getting more of those as the beach became cleaner, He was glad his strength was visibly improving. He'd simply restrain them and call the cops, leaving a cautionary note on their quirk. It wasn't often that he did this, he simply wasn't skilled enough. Most of the time his night ended with him dyed red on the ground. Sometimes there was no blood at all though. He privately thought that those times were worse. He was thankful that his hair regenerated too. It would have been difficult to explain to his mother why he was bald the morning after meeting a particularly violent fire user. It was already difficult enough to explain why he couldn't move his body without groaning in agony that morning, or why his gaze lingered on the candles on the kitchen table for so much longer than usual. He wrote in his notebook that his regeneration was practically limitless. He wondered how his quirk would react to sickness. He knew it overpowered almost all emitter quirk effects and injuries. It was as though he'd never been inflicted with them in the first place. Izuku smiled as he flipped to the first page. He'd managed to answer a lot of his initial questions, but there were still plenty more he'd come across. The line he'd left for the name of his quirk was still empty, and he decided he would change that. He hummed lightly as he wrote, leaving his notebook open on his desk as he got up to stretch. Quirk name, reset. Her night was going much differently than she had expected it to. She had been following someone who caught her eye. A beautiful girl, with dark hair and violet eyes and pale skin that would absolutely glow with a little bit of blood added to it. She wanted to see that. She wanted to become that. She didn't know what the girl's quirk was, but she knew it would be beautiful. She could tell by the way the girl's breaths, growing quicker now that she realized she was being followed through the dark, crystallized in the air. She could have erased her presence, if she had wanted. It was an old trick of hers, but she liked the look of terror paired with her favorite color. The only combination she liked more was blood-stained apathy. But that was rare. She pouted at the thought. The girl she was following was a treat, but she needed something more substantial to keep going. She took out her knife anyways, fading into shadows as the girl sent a glance over her shoulder. Toga Himiko took out her knife. And then her night was derailed. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The tone was flat, but the voice was soft. Young, a bit high-pitched. "A boy." She narrowed her eyes at the hooded figure. She could make out a bit of fabric obscuring his mouth and nose, and his eyes were lost in the hoodie's shadows. She couldn't see any of his features, but a shiver ran through her when she noticed the stains on his clothes. Toga realized the girl she had been tailing was gone when she glanced away from him. She could work with that. The stains on this boy seemed interesting, especially with the detachment in his voice. She could very clearly see red dripping from his arm, and it was the only thing she saw, as though all other colors were nothing more than grayscale as her eyes latched onto the brightness. She wondered if it was his. She wondered if it was someone else's. She knew she wanted to see more. Her knife was twisted out of her grip before she even realized she had moved to slash at the boy. It didn't faze her as she pulled out another, blinking out of existence and digging the knife into his side. He didn't cry out in pain. He didn't even wince. Toga liked that a lot. She pulled the knife out with a twist, and he did gasp at that. And then she pulled the knife up to her mouth. She wanted to see him, covered in blood, and it would be easier to do that if she were him too. His speed surprised her as he grabbed the blade, pulling it away from her mouth and splitting open his palm in the process. Toga couldn't help but whine in disappointment. "That was mine." Her complaints quickly subsided, satisfied by the steady stream of blood was flowing from his palm and side. She admired his tenacity. The longer he stayed up, the longer she would be able to admire her handiwork. But the logical part of her knew she needed to go soon. That girl knew she had been following, and probably called someone after fleeing. She swallowed some of the blood she kept on hand. The man she took it from wasn't her type, but he had a memory-altering quirk that helped her out a lot when it came to law enforcement and witnesses. She could escape this situation quickly, she decided, morphing into a man a lot taller than herself. The boy's head seemed to tilt. "Your quirk is transformation?" The boy asked, voice dropping as he continued speaking, but I could have sworn she disappeared earlier. Was that a technique? She couldn't hear anything after that, but felt a bit prideful at his words. She snapped out of it quickly. She had to get done quickly so she could collect the blood this boy was leaving behind. "I don't want to fight you," the boy said, and she paused. "Why not?" She would abandon her quick escape plan and kill him on the spot if he said it was because she was a girl. Because I want you to teach me. You obviously know plenty of combat techniques. I'm especially interested in the one that let you disappear. She narrowed her eyes at him. This definitely seemed like a trap, but she was intrigued nonetheless. You're pretty interested in this. He waved his bleeding palm at her, sending a few droplets splattered across the pavement, right? She didn't nod, but she might as well have. I'll give you plenty. Meet me here 2 nights from now and we can hash out the specifics. You should go now. I'm sure that girl called someone. It won't be long before they arrive. Toga was quick to leave at that, scaling the side of a building and disappearing over the edge. She could feel him watching her as she left, and couldn't stop the blush from creeping onto her face. Izuku was surprised when she immediately agreed to help him at their next meeting. He quickly handed her 2 bottles, filled to the brim with his blood at that. She excitedly uncapped one, and moved to take a sip, but he hurriedly stopped her. If you drink my blood, you'll die. Izuku wasn't lying. The moment he realized her quirk, he also realized how easily she could figure out his identity. So he decided that he'd make any blood he gave her indigestible. His body had adapted, if only a bit, to the poison of that man's fingernails. It was very potent, but he could move under its influence for 30 minutes rather than his initial 5. He felt a bit of a loss, mixing most of the poison he had left into the blood. It would have been useful to him. She pouted at that. Why? Because my quirk is blood toxicity, he lied. It would dissuade her from drinking it, although that was for her own good, since she really would die. And he could also say he produced blood at a faster rate than average people, which would explain how he managed to bleed so much the other night and collect 4 liters of blood within 2 days. The sparkle of excitement returned to her eyes at that. So your blood is rare? She couldn't wait to add it to her collection, and there was so much too it seemed to be a prettier shade than what she was used to. You could say that. A crooked smile ghosted across his lips. In fact, I'd even call it collector's edition. The negotiations went well, besides the girl's odd comments about him and his blood. He wondered if her quirk affected her mentality. But he didn't dare ask. They decided to meet every other night, and he'd provide her with a vial of blood for her collection upon every meeting. He was glad that his blood didn't lose its utility in her eyes when he had said she couldn't drink it. He didn't think he could offer her anything else she'd want in exchange for her help. His reason for asking for her help, despite her questionably criminal background, was simple enough. He didn't know her record, but he knew he couldn't stop her by himself. And he didn't think the police could either. If he was training with her, she'd be too busy to continue whatever plans she had in mind when she had followed that girl. He was simply putting her villainy on hold for as long as he could. Maybe in that time he'd learn enough to make a profile of her for the police, but he doubted he'd be able to provide them with more than they had already gathered. There was no way the information of someone like him could rival that of professionals. He spent a lot of time justifying his actions by saying it was helping more than it was hurting. But his biggest motivator was that he desperately needed the training. Of course, temporarily keeping a villain off the streets was important too. He was stronger now, but strength without technique meant nothing. This girl had nothing if not technique. Her movements were wild, but they were refined. She was an expert in her craft. He could tell from the way his side still ached despite resetting as soon as she'd left and he'd gotten away from the scene. He couldn't help but feel a bit regretful that the reset erased everything but the pain. His low pain tolerance wasn't exactly the most conducive towards his hero career in the first place. He supposed that, as with everything else, it was just another thing he had to get used to. They decided not to exchange names. Izuku referred to her as Vamp after her quirk and teeth, and she just called him Red. He couldn't fault her consistency. Izuku already knew what she looked like, so she didn't bother to try to hide her face. It didn't matter much anyways, since she could always become someone else if she wanted to. He was a bit more careful, always obscuring his face with masks on hoods whenever he met her. It didn't seem like she cared one way or another. Toga really loved sparring with Red. He told her not to pull her punches, so she didn't. She loved how easy it was to paint him in his own blood and how he never seemed to slow down. She also loved that it was getting more difficult for her as time went by. It made it feel like a hard-earned reward. Whenever her knives grazed his skin rather than a simple gift. Toga loved sparring with him, so she didn't know what she'd do when their time was up. Even she knew that this arrangement was only temporary. Red was a nice boy. Too nice for someone who she stabbed regularly. Anyone with eyes, and even those without, could tell he wanted to be a hero. And she thought, well, she was a murderer. It was an ill-fated friendship. That's what she called it. Friendship. She would be surprised to know Red called it the same. Once I start high school, we can't meet anymore. Toga has seen it coming. Red had been muttering more and more recently, and entrance exams were right around the corner. It still stung, though, the fact that she wouldn't be able to see him again. She wondered if she should kill him, but at this point, she didn't know if she could. He had improved a lot. All right. Toga said, quiet for once. She supposed she'd return to her hunts once Red was gone. Red had been enough to satisfy her, but once he was gone she'd be back to her old ways of prowling the streets. She wouldn't say she was disappointed, but that she would miss this. Don't look so sad, she could hear the smile in Red's voice. I have a going-away present for you. You do? She perked up at that, wondering what it could be. She was pretty sure it'd have something to do with blood, but that was what he paid her with, so maybe not. Yes, but you have to promise me something first. Red's voice was firm now, but Toga could care less. She loved getting presents. At least, from what she'd heard about them, she thought she would love getting a present. What is it? She asked excitedly. Promise me you won't use what I give you unless you're about to die. Okay. Her excitement faded a bit at his cryptic words, and she tilted her head in confusion. Red just sighed and slipped his hand into his pocket, pulling out a little glass vial on a chain. Toga knew what it was immediately. This is my detoxified blood. You can use it to transform into me and copy my quirk. Toga lunged for it before he even finished his sentence, but he easily maneuvered out of her way. Don't use it unless you're about to die, I'm serious. It seemed like he was taunting her, with the way he dangled the necklace in front of her, just barely out of reach. Okay. Just give it to me already. She whined, and he finally handed it over with a laugh. I'll trust you with this, all right? He said one last time. Okay, I'll use it well. And Toga beamed, but it wasn't her usual hungry smile. It was an ordinary smile. The kind most other kids their age wore. It was the first gift she had ever received, and, as she slipped the chain around her neck, she decided she'd never take it off, even if she drank it. She would always be able to remember Red's blood from the vials he brought every lesson. But she had no doubt her memory of the person the blood was from would fade with time, but now she would always be able to remember Red from the chain around her neck. It was probably the happiest she had ever been. Izuku wondered if giving Vamp his untainted blood was a good idea. He decided it wasn't, and did it anyway. Originally, he had collected blood from a couple of resets and added what was left of the crushed-up fingernails of the man who had poisoned him to serve as Toga's payment. He had been sure to test its efficacy before resolving to give it to Toga. Drinking his own blood to check was unpleasant, to say the least. It made him wonder if Toga had altered taste buds, since she really seemed to enjoy drinking blood. He had everything prepared from before the first meeting, and resolved to stretch the amount of blood until the UA entrance exam. He still had some left over now that the meetings were ending, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. It was nothing less than poison at this point. At some point he started to worry about Vamp. She wasn't that much older than him, and the life of a criminal is dangerous. It was easy for him to realize she could disappear so easily, and he really didn't want that. He had long since stopped thinking about ways to turn her in to the police. So he had prepared a little vial of his pure blood, just in case, as his last favor to his second friend. It really was the least he could do. Are you Midoriya Izuku? Two men approached him on the street. One looked ordinary and was holding a clipboard and pen, and the other had a cat head. No, Izuku said, gaze sharp. He didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but he thought his chances of escaping were pretty good thanks to Vamp's lessons. The ordinary man tapped his pen against the clipboard twice, and Izuku didn't think before he bolted. Is this really how they're going to try to kidnap me? He lamented, silently cursing the quirkest bullshit that society seemed to thrive on. If he was lucky, they were just thugs who wanted to beat him up. If he was unlucky, they were part of the professional organization kidnapping quirkless people. He kind of doubted that though, considering that their approach was nothing short of sloppy. Their signal wasn't exactly subtle either. He didn't know how they knew he was Midoriya Izuku, but he planned on finding out. He ducked into an alley, waiting for the first one to arrive and catching him off guard, sending him sprawling onto the ground with a sweep of the leg. "Why are you here?" he hissed, pulling the man's arms behind his back as he glazed around for his partner. The cat was nowhere to be seen. He might be getting back up, so Izuku thought to hurry this along. "Answer quickly or I'll break your arm." The man had the audacity to look shocked at that. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, and Izuku couldn't hold back a scoff. "I'm a detective." "Oh yeah, like I'll fall for that bullshit. A detective wouldn't want anything to do with me. Tell me how you found me, right now or dash." Izuku was about to do something very regrettable, like bringing out his knife, when the cat appeared. "He's telling the truth." The cat pulled out a badge that Izuku narrowed his eyes at. "I'm Sansa Tamakawa with the police, and the man you're standing on is Detective Naomasa Tsukachi." The cat, Sansa, moved to come closer, but Izuku tightened his grip, earning a pained grunt from Tsukachi. "Not another step." The cat stopped quickly so his partner didn't get hurt, which Izuku privately thought was something a villain would not do. "I still don't understand why two detectives would need to meet with me. So forgive me if I don't believe you are who you say you are." While he spoke, Izuku used his free hand to search up the names they mentioned. Information on the members of the police force, including their headshots, was available for public access. He intended to match their faces before anything else. And if they matched, he supposed he'd get on his hands and knees and beg for forgiveness. Of course, this was all for nothing if they had an illusionary or transformative quirk on their side. "We've been talking to all the quirkless people in the area as a matter of safety. We've been trying to get into contact with you for a while, but you weren't at your place of residence when we visited." Izuku wondered why they cared about quirkless safety. Nobody had done anything about it before, so they wouldn't make a difference. His eyes lazily drifted towards his phone, not expecting to recognize the two faces looking back at him from the screen. His eyes widened. He really was going to have to beg for forgiveness, wasn't he? "Oh my God. I'm so sorry." The pitch of his voice shot up immediately as he released Detective Tsukachi. He found it a bit sad that stutter returned in full force once he realized the danger was imagined, and then he remembered he just assaulted a police officer and decided that the stutter was warranted. It seemed like he could only talk normally with criminals and his mom these days, and he didn't even want to think about what would happen if he had to address people his own age. "It's not your fault," the Detective Tsukachi replied, struggling to his feet with the help of Officer Sansa. "We should have been more tactful with our approach, especially with everything that's been going on lately." The detective had said it was fine, but the only thing Izuku could process was his own panic. It would be hard to explain how he reacted. God, he was an idiot. Nobody in their right mind would ambush and threaten someone they thought was about to kidnap them. They'd just run. He couldn't help the distressed noise that escaped him. It earned a bit of a chuckle, meow, from Sansa. "I really overreacted, didn't I?" Izuku said out loud, his words muffled by the hands he was currently burying his face in. "Maybe. Most people at least wait for us to say we are detectives before bolting." Izuku wasn't sure if it was a teasing comment or not, so he stayed silent. "Anyways, we actually wanted to talk to you about getting your prints and a DNA sample. The police want to keep track of quirkless people more carefully so they can be easily identified if they're kidnapped or dash." The word murdered hung in the air, left unsaid. Izuku was less afflicted by the implication that they wanted to be able to easily identify his body than he was by the fact that if the system had his DNA, they would be able to link him to so many so-called crime scenes and a few villain arrests, and even that scene from the first time he fell that was regarded as an unsolved case, suspected suicide. And "Midoriya-kun, are you all right?" Detective Tsukachi asked, and Izuku smiled at him, albeit a bit carefully since his smiles nowadays looked a lot like an animal baring its teeth. "Of course I am," he replied. The pen tapped against the clipboard twice. "I've just never talked to detectives before. No tapping, it's more intimidating than I expected." 2 taps. Izuku couldn't help the long-winded sigh that escaped him. This was just his luck. Things would be difficult from now on. Especially if the detective asked his questions carefully. Of course, this man was the rumored human lie detector of the Mutation police force. The walk to the station was nothing if not awkward. They had offered to walk Izuku home and speak to him there, but he said he wouldn't want his mom to worry if she came home while they were talking. At least, that was one reason he didn't want to do the interview there. The main reason he didn't want to go to his house was that he had left some projects he'd been tinkering with out, and didn't want to deal with any questions about them, especially when every word he uttered could be weighed for its honesty. Once they arrived at the station, they led him to a room that was distinctly not an interrogation room. He knew they did it to make him more comfortable, and because this wasn't supposed to feel like an interrogation because it wasn't an investigation. It sure felt like an investigation to him though, especially since he had so much to hide. Detective Tsukachi offered him coffee as he sat down, and he knew he looked like he needed it. He hadn't bothered making himself presentable that day, since his mom was out of town on business for the weekend, and his quirk didn't save him from anemia. Nor did it save him from the dark circles under his eyes. He must have looked deranged when the officer Sansa saw him in that alley. He resisted the urge to bury his face in his hands and flashed a nervous smile towards Detective Tsukachi. "See, could you start from the top? I still don't really get why you want me here." Izuku was sure he wasn't lying when he said he didn't get it. He knew why they had brought him here. But he didn't understand why they would bother. Not even politicians refrained from sharing their views on the quirkless population. He didn't understand why anyone working under the government would do anything about it either. Sure, Tsukachi smiled reassuringly, as though he had forgotten that the stuttering boy in front of him had pinned him to the ground and threatened him. In light of rise in anti-quirkless sentiments and the serial kidnappings of quirkless people, it was decided that we should collect DNA samples and fingerprints for the system so it's easier to keep track of them if they go missing. The detective kept talking, but Izuku had gotten what he needed out of the spiel. Izuku thought, it's for organization. The idea didn't really sit right with him, and it wasn't because of the way his DNA could be linked to crime scenes. "Do I have the right to refuse?" he asked, his tone shifting a bit closer to the one he had used in the alley. The detective finally frowned at that. "I don't see why you would, but you can dash." "Detective," Izuku cut in, with a smile that wasn't really a smile, "I understand why the policy is in place. But, if you create policies like this around quirkless people, the discriminatory people will never change since even the government acknowledges them as different from people with quirks. I would rather not be a part of anything like that." Both the detective and the officer blinked. At that, and the pen remained still. Tsukachi cleared his throat after a moment, cheeks flushed a light shade of pink in shame. "I guess you're right, I never thought of it that way. Don't feel too bad about it, most people wouldn't have." Izuku's smile softened genuinely. He didn't think Detective Tsukachi or Officer Sansa were bad people. They were probably even good ones. But they could never be expected to understand what it was like to live quirkless. "If that's all, I'll be taking my leave," he said politely, standing up to make his escape. Actually, I have a few more questions." The detective interjected and Izuku's heart fell. If he was asked anything about what happened in the alley, he wasn't sure how well he'd be able to evade Tsukachi's lie detector. He'd have to think of ways around truth quirks. Just in case it was an issue in the future. "It was irresponsible of us to approach this the way we did. We didn't even think of your perspective. If it's all right with you, could you tell us a bit more about quirkless discrimination in laws? We'd be better able to do our jobs if we were informed on the matter." Izuku was surprised to say the least, but it wasn't unpleasant. He spent the next hour rambling to the detectives about the legal system and how quirkless people were treated in the labor force. He went over quite a few laws that could be conducive to discrimination. He used to pore over these laws back when he thought he was quirkless. He thought it would help him understand why he was treated so poorly. It didn't really, but it was coming in handy now. Izuku talked and talked about discriminatory laws, but he didn't mention a single thing about the law defining vigilantism as quirk use without a license. It would be a good fallback for him if he doesn't manage to get into UA. Or if he managed to get in but not stay. The way the law was written, you can't be a vigilante without a registered quirk. The way the law was written, he hadn't done anything illegal yet. Izuku applied to both the general education and heroics courses of UA High School. There were no regulations barring quirkless students from either course, but, while he was confident he could enter general education with his grades, he was not confident in passing the heroics practical exam. Even if he did, he wasn't sure he'd be allowed into the course. His status as quirkless was classified as of now, as per the agreement he came to with the detectives, but that information was necessary for applying to a heroics school, so the administration would know regardless. He didn't think that boded well for him. The difference between the general education application and the heroics application was an essay portion on the written exam and the practical portion of the heroics exam. You could opt to take both, with general education as a backup for failing to get in the heroics course. A lot of people overlooked this opportunity. It was a product of their overconfidence more than anything. Izuku was fine with that though. There was a better chance for him to get in that way and he would take it. Having to take both the essay portion and the practical meant that he had to arrive earlier than the students only taking one exam. He didn't mind that much. He was used to early starts to his day after late nights. He'd recently discovered that when he reset himself it also reset his exhaustion to some extent. It was something he planned to take advantage of. He needed as much time as he could get if he were going to have a chance of becoming a hero. As it was, he barely had enough time to finish one of his resetters. He had a few in mind, subtle ways to reset that would let him regenerate any injuries mid-battle, but he didn't have the skill, materials, or time to make all of them. All he had managed to finish was a knife that looked a bit like a necklace. It was a simple chain with a rectangular charm on it that had a blade that extended and retracted with the press of a button. The blade was about 1.5 inches, just long enough to sever his spinal cord and brainstem if he held it up to the base of his skull and pressed the button. He had done quite a few tests to make sure the blade would retract right afterwards and that it would be able to properly carry out its job. It worked well, and he recovered from it quickly enough to be able to do it mid-step without falling on his face, although he would come close. It also didn't bleed much, since it was so quick. All in all, he was pretty proud of it. It could even be used as an emergency weapon if he took it off its chain. He was fiddling with it as he sat to take the essay portion of the exam. He noticed a bit of blood on it, left over from the morning's last-minute test, and swiped his finger over it, trying to rub it off and only succeeding in smearing the blade. He'd wipe it off later. He finished the essay quickly, especially considering that his rambling translated onto paper and he wrote twice as much as he should have. The topic had been open enough for him to take it in a direction he wanted. He pulled the quirkless card as he wrote. It wasn't a card that often could or should be pulled, but he knew who would be reading these essays. And he also knew the reader of the essays would understand his underlying message. Principal Nedzu, after all, was not a fan of discrimination. He was pretty confident in his essay as he handed it in early and exited the testing room to get some fresh air. As usual, his wrist ached something awful. He was used to it by now, but he couldn't help the glare he sent down at his painful joints as he got a can of iced coffee from the vending machine to press against his wrist. He sat down beneath a tree at the front gate, setting an alarm to remind him when to walk back to the testing site for the rest of the written exam, the multiple choice and short answer section that both general and heroics kids had to take, and closing his eyes. Izuku didn't sleep. He exhaled everything in his lungs, slowly but surely, and wiped his mind. It was something like meditation. Just a step further. It was the method Vamp used to erase her presence. Izuku was, unsurprisingly if you considered all the times he had avoided the attention of others, a natural at it. He could do it for longer than she could. And he could do it more easily, despite the fact that his head was usually fit to burst with all his thoughts. Sometimes he did it unwittingly, and other times he did it just to calm down. Right now he did it to relax away from the eyes of others. He opened his eyes, surveying the grounds, but it would be hard to say if he actually saw anything. A few recommendation kids made their way to the main building and he blinked in half-hearted recognition, watching them until they disappeared into the building. A few of the other kids who had finished the essay early were milling about the schoolyard. Izuku closed his eyes once more, reveling in the quiet of his detached world. And then someone sat next to him. Izuku opened his eyes and turned to look at the person next to him slowly. They didn't notice him, and he knew that was his fault. He blatantly stared for a few moments, before a quiet hello spilled out of his mouth. He swore the boy next to him left the ground with how violently he flinched. "Holy Zich, when did you get there?" the boy exclaimed, and then immediately tensed, frowning as though he said something he shouldn't have. "I've been here," he replied, voice pitched high, and the boy next to him relaxed, just barely, before narrowing his eyes. "Do you have like an invisibility quirk or something?" he asked, and Izuku almost laughed. In fact, he was so close to laughing that he let out an undignified sputter of a snort that had him hiding his face in embarrassment and the boy next to him raising an eyebrow in confusion. "What's funny?" His tone was sharp. "And nothing," Izuku quickly remedied, hoping he hadn't offended this boy. "I just don't have an invisibility quirk." Izuku paused for a moment at the silence and then tacked on an introduction. "I'm Midoriya Izuku, by the way. What's your name?" "Shinso Hitoshi." "Okay, it's nice to meet you, Shinsu-kun." Izuku prepared his brightest and least threatening smile. It was his first time talking to someone his age who was, probably, not a criminal since middle school ended, and it was going surprisingly well. At least that's what he thought, until Shinsu's expression darkened. "You really think that? Why wouldn't I?" Izuku thought any meeting that didn't involve maiming was a nice one at this point. "Never mind, you'll figure it out eventually." Izuku was going to ask what he was supposed to figure out, but Shinso kept talking. "Did you also apply to both heroics and general?" "Yeah." Izuku responded, excited to be on a topic he could contribute to. "I kinda doubt I'm going to be able to get into heroics initially. It seems like the physical exam will be heavily biased towards physical quirks and ones that directly enhance combat capabilities based on the graduates UA tends to put out. Of course, that's totally unfair because combative heroes aren't the only type of heroes to exist, but let's not get into that right now. I'd keep talking until both the written and physical exams had ended." "You have a non-physical quirk?" Shinso asked, and Izuku wondered if that was all he got out of his muttering before it dissolved into incomprehensibility. "Well, I didn't say that, did I?" His smile was nothing short of animalistic, similar to a cat in terms of mischievousness. Shinso couldn't help but want to smile back. Hitoshi thought Midoriya Izuku was odd. It wasn't any one thing in particular that made him think this. It was a bunch of little things that seemed to pile up the longer they conversed. It was hard to pinpoint what made the boy beside him tick. And he had a vague premonition that, if he were to learn, he might not like what he found. But that didn't matter much, because he didn't intend to find out. Hitoshi figured he might as well make the conversation last. Once people learned his quirk, the talking stopped. He was an introvert by nature, but his isolation wasn't by choice. He'd take the interactions he could get. And the never-ending rambling of the boy beneath the tree was included in that. But then, as always, the fateful question came. "What's your quirk?" Midoriya asked, eyes bright like Hitoshi's answer wouldn't chase him off. "Isn't it a bit rude to just ask that?" Hitoshi couldn't help but snap, and Midoriya's eyes widened. Hitoshi couldn't help but regret his tone as Midoriya seemed to hunch in on himself. Sorry." Midoriya avoided his eyes. "I just got too excited and I thought it would be okay since you asked if my quirk was invisibility earlier." His voice trailed off and Hitoshi just sighed. "Sheet." He ground his palm into his temple, where the ever-present ache of his quirk lingered. "I didn't mean to snap at you. It's just he frowned, trying to find the right words to say to excuse his hypocrisy, but really there were none, especially when he knew nothing of the boy in front of him's circumstances. "I have a villainous quirk." There was silence for a few minutes, something Hitoshi hadn't expected from the ever-talkative Midoriya. He almost winced at the thought that he had startled the boy into silence with his admission. It was always like this. "You know, quirks have no sense of morality," Midoriya finally says, and Hitoshi has to unravel the sentence within his brain, uncomprehending of its meaning. "What?" he finally asks, confusion winning out over the bit of pride he had that prevented him from asking and risking ending up the butt of some joke. It had happened before. "So yours can't be villainous." That was not what he expected. "Really, He raised an eyebrow. You don't even know what it is. It could be killing people when I make eye contact with them. Midoriya rolled his eyes at that, meeting Hitoshi's resolutely. Do you think knives are evil? No. Then why would a quirk be? Both are tools that can be used as weapons. Hitoshi didn't respond immediately, so Midoriya kept talking. Now, if you don't mind me asking, what's your quirk? You said you were applying to both general and heroics, so I guess it's probably not combat-related, or maybe it's just not a quirk that can be used in training or exams. You don't have to answer, of course, but I'm dying of curiosity and there are just so many possibilities and dash. Midoriya? Hitoshi asked, cutting the rambling off prematurely. Yes. He responded quickly, expression blanking in an instant. Shut up. Midoriya Izuku stopped talking. And he didn't talk again until Hitoshi nudged him out of his control with a light tap on the shoulder. It took Midoriya a moment to process, eyebrows creasing in thought. Hitoshi subtly wiped his palms on his shirt, hoping Midoriya wouldn't notice his nerves at revealing his quirk. Especially in the way he did. God, he shouldn't have done that. What possessed him to think that was a good idea? Midoriya's prolonged silence did nothing but fuel his unease, and he eventually decided he should just leave silently before this boy decided to report him for illegal quirk use. He really was an idiot for this, wasn't he? A control quirk? Midoriya finally asked. His brow was still furrowed and he was staring at the ground as though trying to uncover treasure buried in the dirt. Hitoshi was about to force out an awkward, stumbling apology when Midoriya finally looked up with a bright smile. That's so cool. Is it activated through speech and deactivated through touch? How many people can you control at once? Do you have any side effects, like headaches? I know mental quirks tend to have effects like that. I bet it makes it hard for you to sleep, right? Ah, wait, maybe that was rude. I mean, you look super tired, but I probably shouldn't point it out like that. Hitoshi stared as Midoriya kept talking, even as he broke past the limits of comprehensibility in speech. He asked questions that he didn't give Hitoshi time to answer, but Hitoshi wasn't really thinking about that. You aren't mad? He finally asks, when Midoriya takes a moment to come up from his rant for air. Why would I be mad? The furrowed brow returns, and Hitoshi is dumbfounded. I used my quirk on you, without your permission. I could have just told you what it was, but I activated it on you anyways. Isn't that terrible? No, it's not terrible. Sometimes it's easier to show people things than it is to tell them. Midoriya's smile was different that time, and Hitoshi had no way of knowing he was thinking of a scene in an alley with a knife and his first friend and all of that blood that only they would ever know was his. They had to separate before the common portion of the written exams since they were in different rooms. Shinso left first. Izuku thought Shinsu's quirk was amazing, and not just because of its potential for hero work, despite what Shinso said about it being villainous, but he was worried. He didn't think Shinso would be able to pass the physical exam. Even if he did, he didn't doubt that his quirk would be flagged as dangerous. If not by the administration, then by other students. Izuku thought it was downright hypocritical that a quirk that could temporarily control people was considered more villainous than one that could create explosions. At least brainwashing was more indirect. Based on his experiences, Izuku knew that death by brainwashing would hurt less than death by explosion, because brainwashing didn't hurt at all. In fact, it was one of the rare moments where nothing hurt Izuku. With brainwashing, there was nothing. And it was over before he knew it. He thought suffering until the end was crueler than not realizing your loss. At least he knew UA would have a zero-tolerance policy on quirk discrimination. But he also knew that kids could be sneaky. He was in the middle of his internal worry for Shinso when he tripped. Of course he tripped. He stubbed his toe on the inside of his shoe, and felt the nail bend backwards and flinched because he wasn't prepared for the sharp pain among his other aches, and he wasn't prepared for the impact with the ground either. But the impact never came. What? I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have used my quirk on you without permission, but you were falling so I just reacted. A girl said, and Izuku's gaze drifted from his stinging shoulder to her hands. There were little circles on the pads of her fingers. Izuku was still processing the fact that he had 2 quirks used on him within half an hour on the UA campus when she spoke again. Anyways, I gotta go, don't want to be late. She put her fingers together, returning him to the ground, waved, and ran off before he could say anything else or attempt to thank her. It was a bit disconcerting for quirks to be used on him without malicious intent. But he was very intrigued by that girl's quirk. Was it floating? Weight cancellation? Some form of telekinesis? He knew it had something to do with her fingers and was activated through touch. He vaguely registered some sort of commotion behind him as he walked. Usually he was much more aware of his surroundings, but the shock of being on a heroic school campus and the idea that UA was safe had erased his usual caution. Later he'd realize how dangerous that sentiment of safety was. Someone ran into him, jolting the shoulder that the girl had smacked to activate her quirk. He appreciated her help, since the fall would have hurt more, but he couldn't help but wish her touch had been a little lighter. Maybe a certain amount of force was a requirement for activation her quirk? Sorry. He muttered to the person who ran into him, eyes trained on the floor. What did you wish? The voice cut off with an audible noise. Like the speaker was being strangled. Izuku looked up hurriedly, almost freezing entirely when he realized who it was. No, he told himself, you aren't scared. He repeated that in his mind, looking directly into the face of his once childhood friend with a sunny expression and fists clenched only just tight enough for his nails to dig crescents into his hand. Bakugo flinched when he met Izuku's eyes and, he was afraid of him. Izuku didn't know what to do with the information or how he made it feel, so he imagined putting it in a tiny black box and left it to grow mildewed in the corner of his mind with all of the other things he'd rather not think about. Good luck on the exam, Kakin, he said, instead of any of the other million retorts or apologies he had stocked up on for this occasion. Bakugo did not reply. He just walked away. He hadn't seen Bakugo in a while. He hadn't planned on seeing Bakugo in a while. But maybe this was better for him. Bakugo would get into the heroics course without a doubt. His written exam scores were top-ranked, and his quirk was good for combat. Perfect hero material. Izuku, on the other hand, would probably barely be accepted to the general education course, despite his high grades and ability. Anyways, if he entered the heroics course after the sports festival, then he would be able to place himself in the class without Bakugo. He didn't want any more surprises. The common written exam was a variety of mid-level questions with the odd extremely difficult question thrown in. Izuku wondered if those were the types of questions the students applying to the support department would get. Speaking on the support department, he was very curious as to whether or not he could get permissions to access their lab and design support items. He wasn't the most adept at engineering, but he was good enough for the items he had in mind. It wasn't like he could ask anyone else to make them either, especially considering their purpose. And, if he made connections to support students along the way, he wouldn't complain. He needed his specialized equipment, but since he would be fighting without a quirk, he should also try to invest in some more high-tech weaponry. Izuku highly doubted people would take kindly to a hero exclusively stabbing villains. Even though knives had a huge amount of utility, yes, Izuku was partial to knives thanks to Vamp's influence, but he wasn't about to admit that he was inspired by an actual serial killer and that said serial killer was probably his best friend. He couldn't help but feel a bit bitter about all of the restrictions, but they were inconsequential in the face of his dream. He was still thinking about the support department when Present Mike Dash, was explaining the rules of the practical. When he heard about the robots, he couldn't help but wonder if the support department had a hand in it since he was already along that train of thought and then quickly wiped that thought out when he fully realized he had to fight robots. He knew the test would be biased. He knew it. But this was worse than he had expected. It was so bad that he couldn't stop himself from throwing a glance around the room to try to catch a glimpse of Shinsu's purple hair and tired gaze. He didn't manage to find him, so he pushed down the gnawing feeling in his stomach and focused. Izuku had known that he wouldn't pass the practical exam, but he didn't think the gap between his abilities and the abilities required to apply to heroics would be quite so wide. I'll just work harder, he muttered, barely registering as another student stood up to ask a question about something after the initial realization Izuku, usually an avid information gatherer, had blocked out everything else. The boy was loud but Izuku didn't hear what he was saying. He was busy listing things about people around him, a trick he learned to rein in his panic. Bird head, belt, brown hair, headphones, thorns dash. And you with the unruly hair dash. Izuku frowned at that, momentarily pausing his chant. It was a very broad identifier, so how was anybody supposed to know it was referring to them? Not to mention it was kinda rude. He realized people were staring at him. Izuku stopped, meeting the boy's eyes. He was afraid to confirm that the boy was talking to him, but he was more afraid of what would happen if he kept ignoring him. Izuku knew people didn't like being ignored by those under them. Bakugo had taught him that lesson well. Stop muttering. It's quite disrespectful, the boy said. It was clear that he was talking to Izuku, but he spoke with a sharp downward hand motion and such a loud voice that Izuku stood up, breath hitching. Sorry. His voice sounded strangled even to his own ears. I just realized I left something in the testing room. I need to go get it. The boy said something else about being irresponsible and properly caring for one's possessions, but Izuku covered his ears as he went. He probably looked unhinged. He wasn't worried about the practical exam as he locked himself in a bathroom stall and tried to wrangle himself into his comfortable state of empty. He knew, somewhere between his hummingbird quick heartbeats and shuddering breaths, that he had gotten his exam ticket and could easily find the location when he was done. The only thing he was worried about right now was the fact that he felt so worried. There was a clawing sensation in his chest, under his skin, and he momentarily wondered if that was him, scratching at his own skin to try to get air somehow. He could swear tears were slipping out of his eyes, but when he rubbed furiously at his face, it was dry. He spent minutes that felt like hours in the stall, trying to relearn things even babies knew how to do. Crying, breathing, screaming. Anything to get rid of the tension. But he still couldn't calm down. He felt something cold and spared a glance at his necklace. He couldn't calm down. But maybe he didn't have to. Izuku was like new when he arrived at the testing site. He didn't even grimace, let alone flinch, when he saw the tall boy with glasses who had scolded him earlier. He had discarded the tracksuit he had been wearing, and was now only in a dark long-sleeved shirt. Outside tools weren't allowed, so he knew he couldn't use his knife on any of the robots. If he went about it correctly, and if it was necessary, he could probably pull off a reset. Izuku figured there might be a hidden aspect to the exam, but he also figured, based on the innate bias the test had already displayed, that that hidden aspect would be no help to him at all. He caught a glimpse of the girl who kept him from tripping before the test started, and moved to greet her, before that boy stopped him. Are you trying to distract her? What? Izuku's tone came out a little sharper than he intended, and the shame turned the tips of his ears red. Luckily his unruly hair should hide it. She is obviously trying to focus before the exam. She is doing her best, and you are attempting to sabotage her efforts. The boy continued speaking, and Izuku couldn't help but think that he was making huge leaps in his assumptions. Izuku thought he could take advantage of that. I wasn't going to talk to her though. I was just trying to get a better view of the testing site. His voice sounded light and came across as truthful, but it was flat in an odd way that the boy in glasses couldn't place. Oh. The boy stuttered, face reddening as he swung his hand in that same mechanical motion that made Izuku want to duck under his arms. He crushed that feeling with the stinging in the back of his neck and the cool detachment he always felt after a reset. It is admirable to try to prepare as much as possible before performing a task. The boy switched gears and Izuku looked at him with an emptily polite smile. Izuku had to wonder if the boy couldn't even recognize him from the scene in the lecture hall when instructions were being given out, or if he cornered him because he did recognize him. Yeah. So I'll get to that, he replied, a bit more shortly than he should have, and went over to the gate. Luckily the practical was starting, so Izuku let present mix Quirk drown out all of the unpleasant thoughts he might have had about that boy and this exam. Izuku could not confidently say exactly what occurred during the first 7.5 minutes of the exam. He knew he was one of the first people to run into the testing site, at least he had his reaction time going for him, and that the robots were not something he could damage. He had tried to lure the robots into shooting each other with their lasers, but they were apparently installed with an anti-friendly fire function that he couldn't help but curse. He finally managed to latch on to the exposed wire of one of them after the 5-minute mark, shocking himself so severely that his palm was covered in electrical burns. At least the robot had stopped moving. Izuku figured he could fix it later, even though even the air on the raw skin of his palm was agonizing. He knew at some point he passed by the girl, and he surmised that the quirk was not telekinesis since it only seemed to make things float and then drop without adding in any other vectors. There was also a blonde boy with a laser, not dissimilar to the robots, that he had to move out of the way of a three-pointer when he doubled over saying something about twinkling and his stomach. Izuku labeled it a quirk side effect and ignored it. He knew something was wrong at 7 minutes. He felt like something under the ground had moved, which wasn't something that he could ignore, especially with the feeling of dread that only grew stronger as the clock ticked down. At 7 minutes and 30 seconds, he heard a low rumbling noise and noticed a suspiciously clear area of land in the middle of the testing site. He also saw the severely damaged infrastructure around that area, and the faint line bisecting it. "They aren't trying to kill us, are they?" he asked, only to be cut off by Present Nick's voice. 2 minutes left. Time to make things exciting with the appearance of a huge enemy, the zero-pointer. The empty space started shaking, disturbing the debris and buildings around it and sending examinees running in the opposite direction. It was an unstable area with pieces of cement falling and kicking up dust over the surroundings. Anybody left behind was liable to be crushed. The girl was still there though. She wasn't moving as quickly as the others and looked distinctly ill. Similar to that blonde boy. Izuku knew a lot about quirk exhaustion. He knew how Kamui Woods got stiff and brittle, how Endeavor overheated, how MT Lady got cramps. He was familiar with the signs of quirk exhaustion in most heroes. It was only natural that his knowledge could be applied to others. So he knew this girl was exhausted. And he knew this girl was about to spew her guts on the pavement and get crushed by falling debris. She was the type to instinctively activate her quirk. And they'd both end up crushed if she did, so he breathed in and did what he did best, avoided attention. And then he ran towards her. The robot hadn't fully emerged from the ground yet, so everything was still shifting as he shoved her out of the way. He caught a glimpse of the robot as he fell. It was massive, but he also saw the unbalanced cement above him shake free of its perch and fall towards him. At least the robot's not my problem, he thought, wryly, before resigning himself to being crushed. Meanwhile, the teachers watching were trying to figure out if the blurred movement the cameras picked up had been a student or a smudge on the screen. Aizawa shifted uncomfortably as he glanced at the other teachers. Were there any concealment quirks or speed quirks in this zone? Besides the Ida boy, no for speed. Ken replied, frowning at the screen. All of them knew the signs of the Idas, and they also knew their youngest member hadn't pushed the girl out of the way of the rubble. Hagakure Toru was in this zone, but we've been tracking her separately to make sure she got a fair amount of points, so it wasn't her. "I'm going to check," Aizawa declared, stalking out of the room. All of the staff could only hope that nobody was buried under that rubble as he left. Izuku coughed out a cloud of dust as he ruffled his own hair to get the debris out of it. The debris hadn't crushed him as badly as he thought they would. The building material must have been selected to be lightweight to prevent deaths this way. That wasn't to say he wasn't injured. He had a feeling of displacement in his chest, and was almost certain the heaviness when he tried to take a breath was liquid filling his possibly punctured lungs. Every movement was agony. But it was an agony he was used to. So he carefully shifted the debris, sacrificing a few bones in exchange for speed as he extracted himself. His pinky finger had purpled from being crushed and he couldn't move it. He was almost certain that it was nothing more than a loosely held together bag of skin with blood and bone dust inside of it, especially with the way it seemed to dangle limply against his palm. He couldn't actually feel it, which was new. So he knew the damage must have been extensive. It might be easier to cut it off and regrow it than to fix the damage it had received. Izuku's ankle twisted with a snap as he yanked it out from under a rock and pushed out from under the pile. He was almost clear. He would reset after he got out. He didn't want to risk anyone finding him if it took longer for him to heal than usual. By the time Izuku got out, he was scraped all over and he worried there would be blood on the rocks. He pushed the worry aside as he pulled himself into the empty interior of one of the site's still intact buildings. The way he grabbed his necklace and shifted it into position was practiced, despite the fact that every part of him burned. He reset right as the exam was announced to have ended. Izuku appeared in tattered clothes at the exam entrance only 5 minutes later. Not long enough for anyone to look for him. He couldn't hide his limp, despite the fact that there was no remaining injury, but he didn't look so out of place among the other battered examinees. He noticed movement out of the corner of his eye, and he would have turned his head to look if not for the violent crick in his neck. He ended up turning his whole upper body, stretching his spine unpleasantly as he did so. There was a scruffy man inspecting the pieces of cement he had crawled out of only a few moments prior. He had a scarf, which Izuku thought was unseasonable for all of 10 seconds before realizing he was looking at Eraserhead. Eraserhead? He works here. Izuku asked under his breath, keeping his excitement in check. He loved Eraser for a few reasons, especially his efficacy on hero missions, although the details were always very difficult to uncover. And if Izuku also liked the fact that he was a well-respected underground hero despite his non-physical quirk, then nobody had to know. Eraserhead's gaze switched from the rubble to Izuku sharply, as though he had heard him, which he definitely shouldn't have been able to with the distance. Izuku waved. Eraserhead narrowed his eyes and did not wave back. In Izuku's book, it was another successful encounter with one of the heroes that inspired him. He couldn't help the grin on his face, even if it was a twisted thing. And for a moment he forgot how much everything still hurt. While waiting for his acceptance letter, Izuku tied up a few loose ends. He formally stopped attending self-defense classes. He had been skipping out of classes with a frequency that worried his mother, so he just resolved to quit entirely and visited the beach, which had been mostly cleaned in his desire to hit a little harder. He wanted to make sure he hadn't left anything incriminating behind from his quirk tests. He wondered if he should clean up that last pile of trash as he combed through the sand for a stray vial of poisoned blood or the forgotten tip of a pinky finger. He ended up finding a few razors that he wasn't sure were his but took anyways. He wasn't quick to make a decision when it came to what he should do with his quirk training haven, read as Trash Fort, but eventually started the arduous process of dragging pieces of the last pile away to the boardwalk's dumpster. He could figure out more of his quirk over school breaks, and by then he was sure to have found a new place to train. Not to mention the practical experience he would be able to gain at the top heroics school in the country, even if he wasn't in the heroics course. His mother panicked when she received the letter, running up to Izuku's room and shoving the letter towards him. "Aizu! The letter came!" she exclaimed, and even though he could see that the letter came from the fact that it was hovering under his nose, he smiled, indulging her excitement. "Want to open it with me?" He only offered because he was confident in his general education scores. The answer sheet was posted a week after the exam, and he had, by his calculations, aced it. If they tried to reject it after that, he could threaten to sue for quirk discrimination, not that his mother had the financial means to back that threat up. But he doubted Principal Nedzu would let that happen, even if the school board didn't agree with his views. His mother agreed ardently, and parked herself on the edge of his bed. He sat next to her with a little laugh, pulling out the first piece of paper. "Congratulations on your acceptance to UA's General Education Department," greeted him, and he had to hold back a tiny smile at the fact that they had cut to the chase with the acceptance. He was a little relieved, even though he knew he should have passed easily. Would have passed easily if he was anyone with a registered quirk. It felt like a gift, even though he had earned it. But it didn't stop there. The letter detailed his grades on the exams, commending him for doing so well, and wasn't that odd, for him to be genuinely praised by anyone other than his mother, and even had an extra note from Principal Nedzu commenting on something he had written in the short response section on the common exam. Izuku almost stopped breathing at that. Principal Nedzu had been intrigued by something he'd written, and he had implied he'd like to speak with him in person. Izuku wasn't sure he could handle meeting someone who was arguably the smartest on Earth, especially when he had so much to hide. His mother was crying by now, pride gleaming in her already wet eyes. He laughed softly and flipped her hair over her shoulder. There was a lot of information for him to process and an equal number of forms he had to fill out to complete his enrollment. But what there wasn't was any mention of the heroics course. Izuku wasn't sure what he was doing when he showed up on UA's campus before school started for the year, for the sole purpose of inquiring after his other application. The lost one. He should have just taken it as a rejection. But there was no sense of resolution in that. If he was going to be rejected anyways, he thought he should have the decency of being told straight out, rather than ignored and forgotten. It had taken a long time to set up an appointment with one of the test administrators. All of the employees were insanely busy, and campus security ensured he jumped through as many hoops as possible to set foot within the gates. But now he was here, waiting in the front office to meet someone who was probably a pro-hero, and he had no idea what he was doing. Midoriya Izuku? A voice asked, and his neck snapped up to look at whoever had called him. It was a girl he didn't recognize, likely a student intern based on their uniform. He was surprised that she was working during break, but he supposed he should have expected that from a school like UA. That's me. He replied softly, almost hoping she wouldn't hear him and would leave the room without a second look. Come with me, she said, shortly but not impolitely. She was professional, likely a soon-to-be business course third year. He trailed after her silently, his steps fading with the noise of hers. Every now and then she'd cast a glance over her shoulder and her eyes would widen, like she was surprised he was still there. Here we are, she said, stopping in front of an office at the end of a hallway. Izuku tried to ignore the light reflecting off of the security cameras hidden by the door. Most people wouldn't have noticed. And if this was the office of who he thought it was, there would be more that were a lot less obvious. The semi-obvious blind spots of the poorly hidden cameras only made him more sure that the visible cameras were a decoy. He thanked the girl before knocking, and was greeted with the voice he expected but was not prepared for. Come in. The voice was not unlike his when he was a child. Hi, chirpy. Strangely devoid of malice. Izuku's hands were trembling as he turned the doorknob, and he knew Principal Nedzu would be able to hear it. A frantic thought crossed his mind that maybe he hadn't washed his clothes properly and Nedzu would smell the blood on them. Or he'd recognize his smell for something he'd left behind in the testing site. There had been blood on those rocks. Why had he left blood on those rocks? He calmed himself by telling himself that Nedzu had hired Hound Dog for a reason. And Hound Dog wasn't here, which meant they hadn't sniffed him out. Hello, he said as calmly as he could, forcing his mouth around the word to prevent it from stuttering out. It's a pleasure to meet you, Principal Nedzu. I'm Midoriya Izuku. Although you probably already knew that, hung in the air between them and Nedzu's already welcoming smile broadened. Izuku was just pleased that his stutter seemed tamed by the fact that Nedzu was a rat-bear dog and not a human person. I actually wanted to speak with you, Midoriya-kun. Forgive me for withholding your letter. Nedzu's hand, paw, twisted and an envelope with Izuku's name stamped across it appeared in his grip. I had a feeling you wouldn't come otherwise. Ah. Izuku said, so this was a trap? His voice flattened out uncontrollably, the way it did when he was disappointed or sad or scared, or really when he felt any emotion other than positive indifference or happiness. There was that too. I guess you could see it that way. The cheerfulness remained as the principal bounced out of his seat and rounded his desk, moving the letter towards Izuku. Here you are. Izuku took it far more cautiously than any other kid his age might. I'm sure you know what this says. His voice was sub-zero, and I guess you just wanted to see my expression when I read it? Not quite, Nedzu said, but you should read it now anyways. Izuku narrowed his eyes, but he did as the principal said. It was as he expected. A rejection letter. He was glad he'd trained his tear ducts, but he was also worried that that training wasn't enough even though he had known this would be the result. His eyes skipped the top scorer rankings the moment he saw the first character of Bakugo's name in the number 1 slot, and fell to the bottom. Surprisingly, he wasn't there. Instead, he was slotted in the middle at rank 43, only 2 points off from the score of rank 40s. A heroic student score. He only had 1 villain point, but he had 35 rescue points. He wondered if it was from pulling that blonde boy out of the way and the few times he made sure to protect other students from stray shots and quirks. Maybe it was from pushing that girl out of the way, although if they saw him do that he may have a problem, because they'd also have seen him crushed under debris and wouldn't that raise questions. I'm leaving, Izuku said, the moment he managed to tear his eyes off of the paper. So soon? Nezu asked, and Izuku thought his grin had never seemed more genuine, and he couldn't help but be a bit frightened of the 85-centimeter tall mammal. I got what I came for. He tried for a polite smile, but he was aware he fell flat. What if we told you that you could still get into the heroics course? Nezu offered, and Izuku half-turned to look at him over his shoulder. Yeah, through the sports festival, right? I was already planning on it. He was tired, and he wanted to go home before he broke down in the office or in one of UA's many hallways. Actually, the hallways, with how empty they should be this time of year and how big they were seeming like a more attractive option by the minute. Not that. He's talking about the unclaimed rescue points. It wasn't the principal talking, and Izuku leaped so far in the air that he would have ended up perched on Principal Nezu's desk if he hadn't caught himself mid-jump. He hadn't noticed the other man was there until he spoke. And it was rare for someone to slip under Izuku's radar. Eraserhead. And there was his old friend, rearing its head the moment he was faced with anybody even slightly outside of his comfort zone. Oh. Nezu asked, eyes gleaming. You know him? Izuku couldn't do anything but nod in response. You must know a lot about heroes if you even recognize the underground ones. Shudakun here is especially good at remaining undercover, despite being a full-time teacher at UA. Nezu continued with his pleasantries as though he hadn't been pulling Izuku along like a fish on the line. It took Izuku a moment to regain himself, but once he did, he turned to Eraserhead, whose civilian name was apparently Shoyuda, but Izuku didn't know if it was his surname or given name and therefore wouldn't dare refer to him with it. Eraserhead-sensei, what were you saying about unclaimed rescue points? Eraserhead sighed when Izuku asked, even though he must have known the question was coming. He was the one who prompted it, after all. In your testing site, there was an incident when the zero-pointer was released. According to one of the students involved, she was pushed out of the way of falling debris. The proctors were unable to determine who was responsible for this, resulting in 45 unclaimed rescue points being available to students within the area. So anyone can claim them? Izuku knew those points were his. And he knew Eraserhead suspected they were his. But he couldn't confirm it, even if it would shoot him to the top of the practical exam score rankings. Combined with his written exam scores, he'd probably place first along all of the applicant students. He didn't need first place though. He needed to keep his quirk, and everything that could implicate he had won a secret. Of course, if they can prove they are the one who earned them. Eraserhead's gaze turned sharp, but Izuku met it with the little steel he had left at the moment. Well, I wish them luck then, and hope the points are returned to their proper owner. Izuku ended the conversation quickly. He exchanged a few pleasantries in the form of goodbyes and left before Nezu could question him about his written test as well. Izuku knew the principal wanted to, and even though avoiding that line of questioning now invited another conversation in the future, he thought it was better than staying in the room with Eraserhead a second longer. He took the letter with him, the one clearly outlining his rejection, and let out a deep breath the moment he was out of Nezu's sight, which he judged to be 3 blocks off of campus. At this point, Izuku was probably the first student in UA's history to be relieved that he hadn't gotten into the heroics course. The child was undoubtedly interesting, just as Nezu had suspected. He left in a hurry, seemingly paying no thoughts to claiming the points as his own. Even if they weren't his, most kids would be tempted by a near free pass into heroics. As long as they had 3 points of their own, would end up tied with 40th place with that amount of rescue points. In fact, Nezu had received a fair amount of claims from applicants within the testing site, but none of the claims matched the information they had, so they were denied. Nezu was almost certain that Midoriya Izuku was involved in the incident of testing site 1B, but he couldn't do anything as long as the boy in question denied it. The child would undoubtedly be in the heroics course soon enough, so the principal decided to let it be. At least, he decided that's how he would let it appear on the surface. Shudakun, Nezu chirped, and Aizawa looked up at him with a grunt. I got it. I'll watch him. He's going to be in mixed class, right? Yep. Nezu climbed back onto his desk chair. I'm going to have to start preparing for his transfer now though. I'm sure the board won't like having a quirkless student in the heroics course, but since his information is already classified, I suppose I can work my magic. Nedzu was nothing short of gleeful at the thought of sliding the board. Aizawa would be just as pleased if he was able to do anything against the board, but he wouldn't show it as easily as Nedzu. Aizawa stood up. "I'm leaving. Bye-bye, Shudakuen." Nedzu waved as the door closed behind Aizawa and sipped his tea, which he hadn't gotten a chance to drink with Midoriya Izuku. He had been planning on offering the boy tea and a seat the moment he stepped inside, but the boy's frantic heartbeat and steady expression had stopped him. It was an odd combination, as though he suspected he had been caught doing something wrong. It was something Nedzu would figure out. He needed to figure it out. Nedzu was a little disappointed he had missed out on the opportunity to hear Midoriya's thoughts on the written test. He was starving for an intellectual conversation these days, but his grin widened as he glanced down at Midoriya's file on his desk. There would be plenty of opportunities to speak with him later. Katsuki had placed first on the practical exam. And when he looked at the score list, he couldn't help but feel sick when he found Deku's name. 36 points. 35 of them were rescue, while Katsuki had gotten a total of 77, with no rescue points at all. Of course Deku had beaten him in that. Katsuki had the top score, yet Deku had still one-upped him. That bastard. Katsuki shook his head furiously, as though he could dislodge the thought with pure force. He had no right to think anything about Deku anymore. In fact, he doubted he should even be allowed to let his childhood friend and victim's name leave his mouth or float around his brain. His throat burned and his mouth tasted of bile. He probably shouldn't have been allowed to apply to UA. Hell, he wouldn't be allowed if Deku had stayed. Hadn't come back. Bakugo Katsuki knew he was not a hero. Sometimes he thought of his friend's corpse and the drowning feeling of being choked by that slime villain and all of that blood and thought that maybe he shouldn't be a hero. If you asked him, he'd deny it, but Katsuki could pinpoint the moment he went wrong. It was probably the moment he got his quirk. No, maybe it was even before that, when he decided he would be number one in everything he did. He threw up in the bathroom, his acceptance letter crumpling in his hand against the ceramic bowl as he retched. Bakugo Katsuki had killed someone. And when he glanced at the crumbled paper in his fist, he was still the top scorer on the heroics exam. Izuku walked into 1C with his brightest, most normal smile. His smile scrunched his eyes until they were near shut, hiding the bags under them splendidly. The smile fell a little when he saw Shinso. Although he had known from the scores that Shinso hadn't made it into heroics, he couldn't help but hope something would change for his maybe-friend neutral acquaintance. He brightened his grin back up the moment Shinso looked in his direction. He didn't think Shinso would take any type of empathetic disappointment well. "We're C classmates," Izuku greeted, sitting in front of Shinso, who had, in conjunction with his character, selected a corner seat in the back of the class. "Yeah." Shinso couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice, but Izuku knew, at least he thought he knew, he could be wrong, that it was bitterness at the practical exam rather than Izuku being in his class. "I guess we just have to work a bit harder," Izuku said, allowing his own bitterness into his voice. He was close. He had been close. Even without the unclaimed rescue points, that served as nothing more than a trap. "Does it really matter how hard we work?" Shinso asked, and Izuku blinked. "Well, why? If we perform well in the sports festival, we can move up to the heroics course." "I know that," Shinso sighed, "but do you even think they'll let us?" "They'll definitely let you, at least," Izuku reassured. If Eraserhead taught the classes he suspected he did, Shinso definitely had a shot. Izuku could see more than a few similarities between the two. "And not you?" Shinso asked, probing for information Izuku wouldn't easily offer. "You should spar with me." He changed the subject and Shinsu's eyebrows shot towards his hairline, the most expression Izuku had seen on him other than frustration and vague smugness. "What? You're all skin and bones. And lanky. You kinda look like a breeze could knock you over. You should learn to fight." "Oh, so you know how to fight then, shorty? Well enough to kick your butt." It slipped out before he could stop it, too used to the banter between him and Vamp. He had two modes with people his age, stuttering mess and rude. Vamp was the only one rude applied to, along with the occasional kid trying their hand at being a criminal. "Where's this confidence coming from?" Shinso groaned, setting his head on his desk. You were stuttering not 3 minutes ago. That was just a part of the free trial. Unluckily for you, you didn't unsubscribe before the trial PRD ended and now are stuck with the full version. Oh God. Shinso groaned, burying his face into his hands, but the edges of his smile peeked out, and Izuku had to wonder if he was the one who people usually felt stuck with. Izuku would be more happy to take that place for him. The class was almost full at this point, and nobody was paying them any attention. Shinsu's shoulders relaxed a little at that and he sighed. What have I gotten myself into? Shinso asked, just after Present Mike walked into the room. Trust me, Izuku said, and his smirk was anything but trustworthy. You haven't seen anything yet. Somehow, Shinso believed him. Yamada Hisashi loved first days. He loved meeting all of his new little listeners and learning about them. He loved first impressions. And he loved how they could change. Hisashi was a people person, which is why he plastered a solid smile across his face to greet his class. He was an extrovert. Shoyuta was not. He had known Shoyuta for years, and because of that, he did a double take when he saw one of his students. He definitely recognized that expression and cadence. The student had purple hair that stuck up wildly and eye bags that matched the kid in front of him, and made Hisashi wonder what could be in the water to produce such tired children. If he remembered his student files correctly, the kid's name was Shinso Hitoshi, but Hisashi thought he might slip and call him Shoyuta. He thought he might get a kick out of doing it on purpose. Especially in front of the actual Shoyuta. The boy in front of Shinso made Hisashi stop once more. He had been especially careful in looking at one file in specific. Shoyuta had asked him to watch out for him. Midoriya Izuku. The first quirkless person to attend UA, maybe even the first to set foot on campus. He'd only met a few quirkless people during his lifetime. And most of those meetings had been on patrol. On the edge of a cliff. Hisashi couldn't say he understood the discrimination. But he did understand what it did. And, seeing this boy in front of him, despite everything, made him proud. Here was someone who persevered. Here was someone who had seen the worst and still hoped for the best. Midoriya looked tired. Hisashi couldn't help the way his practiced expression softened, along with his voice, when he looked at the first quirkless student he would ever teach. Midoriya didn't meet his eyes, and he wouldn't force him to. He knew he'd make mistakes with him. But he also knew he'd learn from them. That way he wouldn't make those mistakes with any other quirkless students that came his way. And he could only hope there would be more. Izuku could feel Present Mike watching him. He stared at his desk. He didn't really know what to do, especially because Present Mike's eyes didn't feel malicious. They felt anything but. He definitely did not know what to do with that. Hello little listeners. I'm Present Mike, and I'll be your homeroom and English teacher this year. You can call me Mike Sensei or Yamada Sensei. Now, can I get a yeah? Yeah, some of the students half-heartedly muttered, but Present Mike didn't falter. You guys will be yelling that back at me by the end of the year. It was a bit disconcerting because it was a promise more than anything else. It could have even been a threat if it had been about anything consequential. Okay listeners, it's time for introductions. Present Mike started and he was loud, but Izuku had half a mind to think he was quieter than usual. Izuku knew they weren't allowed to disclose his quirk, or lack thereof, without permission, considering the new security measures the police force had been taking, but he couldn't help his flinch when introductions were mentioned. They were always the same. Name and quirk. Nothing else. And, unless your name was a big name, the quirk always overshadowed it. Sometimes Izuku looked at hero families with a bit of jealousy. He loved his mom, and even with the option of being born into a hero family, he would have chosen her, but he couldn't help the twinge when he thought about the fact that if he had been born to Endeavor, or to All Might, or to Ryoku, or any hero near the top, people would forget he was quirkless. He'd be a hero's son, rather than a useless Deku. Their names were untouchable. But his wasn't. Instead of boring normal introductions, we're gonna play a game. You have until the end of next week to guess your classmates' quirks and submit your guesses. Whoever gets the most points will win a prize. So right now we'll just introduce ourselves with our names. Izuku thought it was brilliant, because nobody would ever suspect a quirkless kid at UA. Especially with all of the invisible quirks in the world. ranging from being able to perform any calculation immediately to having perfect balance to the point of tripping being near impossible. This activity was in Izuku's wheelhouse. He wasn't confident about a lot of things. But if there was one thing he was good at, and knew he was good at, it was quirk analysis. Izuku couldn't see the future. But Izuku knew he'd win that prize. Hitoshi had half a mind to be terrified the moment Present Mike announced the guessing game and Midoriya's expression changed from something apprehensive to something voracious. He was also relieved though, because he wouldn't have to stand up in front of everybody and tell them he could take control of them in the middle of a simple conversation. You should tell me your quirk since I told you mine. Hitoshi didn't whine. He didn't. Sorry, that's classified. Izuku said it with a wink and Hitoshi crossed his arms. He was a bit too competitive for his own good, and he knew that, but he couldn't help but feel cheated. Yeah, well my quirk was classified too until some happy-go-lucky BSRD came along and tricked me. There was a minute change in Midoriya when he said that. Like suddenly he was smaller. Nothing else had changed though, so Hitoshi thought he must have been imagining it. Sorry about that. Midoriya replied and Hitoshi had not been imagining things. He didn't know exactly what he had said. Maybe it was how he said it. Maybe it was a lot of little things about the situation they were in. Maybe the classroom lights were too bright or their classmates were too loud or maybe the slightest bit of bitter competitive spirit had slipped out when he called Midoriya a happy-go-lucky BSRD. Or maybe he was exaggerating and nothing was wrong at all and Midoriya's quirk was just changing his stature. You'll regret that apology when I win this guessing game even with your head start. He thought he may be wrong to say that. But he also thought it might be wrong to ask Midoriya what had happened, or to even acknowledge there was a change. So he didn't. Is that right? Midoriya hadn't stopped smiling throughout the entire conversation, but it seemed a little softer now than it had been before. He could count that as a success. Half of the first day was spent listening to Nezu's speech at the entrance ceremony, with Izuku avidly avoiding the gaze of the mouse-dog-bear but, most importantly, principle of UA. The second half was spent being briefed on focuses within the general education course. UA's school motto was Plus Ultra, so maybe that was why they had no less than 40 course subsections for GE students to look at, on top of the usual educational requirements. There was a section for students interested in medicine, sections that worked with management and support, and there was even a quirk analysis section that almost swayed Izuku. Of course, the section Izuku wanted was the one centered around the heroics course. Students in this section were allowed to help during training exercises, playing victims and setting up and the like. Izuku thought it would be the perfect opportunity to observe the heroics class and find a way to weasel himself and Shinso into it. He didn't know if the phrase, know your enemy, applied here, because the heroics course wasn't his enemy, but he found himself reciting the phrase back at Shinso when he settled on taking that section without trying any of the others. There were, after all, trial PRDS for the different ones and even a section that let you visit whichever one you wanted whenever you wanted. I don't know whether to be terrified of you or not. Shinso sighed after Izuku finished a rant about all of the hero student quirks he would catalog and all the weaknesses he would be able to find. If you're terrified of everybody, you'll never be caught off guard. Izuku said, and Shinso only looked more disturbed. I mean that you're right, but I wish you weren't? Yeah, I know. Speaking of me being right, I figured out 3 of our classmates' quirks just now. How? I had some suspicions about their quirks after they started loudly discussing them to confuse the rest of us, and my suspicions were confirmed when I saw one of the girls cough up a spider. A spider? How does that confirm anything? Maybe it hints at her quirk, but definitely not the others. You've a lot to learn, Shinsukuan. The spider is part of the trap and I don't know that girl's quirk. What? Shinso looked more confused than anything else at this point, and Izuku couldn't help but feel a bit satisfied at that. Usually he's the one who's left out of the loop. I'll explain it to you after I win, can't be giving away free points. Cheap. Izuku started laughing softly as Shinso narrowed his eyes and turned away from him. The 4 had had a decent plan. They discussed their cover quirks, and then tried to prove them. They had said the girl coughed up insects. Izuku wasn't about to mention that a spider was an arachnid, not an insect, but he certainly wanted to, and made up some improbable lies for the rest of them. They were trying to prove honesty by proximity. One of the boys had tapped the girl's shoulder, and she had started coughing. Then another's eyes flashed, just enough to be a trick of the light, and a spider appeared in her hand. The third person in the group, a girl, conjured up a throat lozenge. She had tried to be subtle by motioning like she pulled it out of her pockets, but the girl's uniform skirt didn't have pockets. He could get the specifics down later, but so far he had inducing coughing fits, minor illusions, judging by how focused the boy had been when he made that spider, and either a dimensional pocket or summoning. He figured they all knew each other's quirks from middle school and wanted to limit the amount of points the rest of the class could get off of them. Too bad that wouldn't work on him. Izuku had figured out the quirks of his entire class by the end of the first week. He's told Shinso that, and the fact that he wouldn't have figured Shinso's out if he hadn't told him, at one point, and Shinso had just grumbled and looked away. He seemed a bit consoled by the fact that he was good at hiding his own quirk, at least. Izuku didn't stop at 1CS quirks though. He also figured out the quirks of quite a few heroic students, especially the ones in 1, that was thanks to a phone recording taken from the second floor of a quirk test, specifically the part of the quirk test where Eraserhead had expelled a student, but that wasn't what Izuku was focused on. The video had been taken down quickly after it was posted, but not before Izuku had saved it. It was thanks to the video that he could say, with confidence, that he knew the ins and outs of at least a quarter of their quirks and the basics of the remaining 75%. He had also gotten some information on the training exercise, but he hadn't been able to watch the match with Bakugo, and missed out on looking more closely at the quirks of the two people who remembered most from the practical exam. He was more than a little disappointed he hadn't been called upon to set up the training, since it was so early in the school year, but Present Mike had told him that he and the other students in his subcourse would be playing victims during disaster simulations at the USJ, so the disappointment faded quickly. Class 1B had been a bit more difficult, but he learned by observing them at lunch. Especially the loud, anti-1A, which didn't make any sense since the classes weren't actually split based on how well the students did on the entrance exam, boy who could copy quirks. Izuku was lucky that the boy liked periodically touching his classmates to get a grasp of their quirk. It let him take a lot of notes, especially since the boy's personality bordered on XHBC when it came to quirks. Despite his attitude, the boy seemed serious about hero work. He was practicing his quirk as often as he could, after all. Izuku thought it might be good to keep his distance from him. Monoma, calm down. A girl, Kendo, appeared and silenced his rant with a smack of a supersized hand. Izuku wondered if her quirk drawbacks were similar to MT ladies. He found it likely, considering lots of gigantification and shrinking quirks were similar in those regards. Her skin must have amazing elasticity. Izuku sighed and Shinso shot him a vaguely alarmed look before putting in his earphones and watching cat videos for plausible deniability if he was ever asked about Izuku in the future. Izuku ignored him and sighed, resting his chin on the table and stabbing at his plate with his chopsticks. He knew it was bad table manners, but Shinso wouldn't care, so he did it anyway. He was more tired than usual. There had been a commotion with the press that morning, but Izuku was too busy analyzing quirks to figure out what it had been about, but pushing his way through a crowd of reporters had drained his energy and sent his nerves through the roof. The idea of being recorded didn't appeal to him, especially as part of a targeted group and someone with a lot to hide. Izuku had been too focused on quirks to do much other than talk with Shinso, who was also pretty out of the loop when it came to gossip and turnout assignments. Maybe that was why he was so surprised when he saw All Might pass through the hallway by the lunchroom entrance. He wasn't in his hero form, but he had an identification tag that was beyond a visitor's pass. It was the kind of tag administration and teachers wore. Izuku broke his chopsticks, and Shinso raised an eyebrow, reluctantly looking away from the cat video playing on his phone. "Did those chopsticks wrong you or something?" he asked, pressing his lips together and scrunching his nose. The wood was splintering in Izuku's hand, and he could feel it ripping into his skin. "Probably." Izuku sighed, trying to sound indifferent as he opened his hand and pulled out the reddened pieces of wood. He held his hand over a napkin, so the blood wouldn't drip on the table. "Dude," Shinso said, brows furrowed, "is your quirk pain tolerance?" What the hell are you doing? Go to the nurse. It's not. My pain tolerance is actually pretty low. Izuku made a sour face when that slipped out and sighed. He should be more careful. Information like that could be used against him. This isn't bad enough to go to the nurse for. He settled on, and Shinso rubbed his temples. Are you always like this? No. Izuku started, but he wasn't able to say much more before Shinso's quirk took hold. Go to the nurse and get your hand treated. Be careful on the way there. Shinso's instructions were surprisingly careful, and Izuku moved to carry them out without a thought while Shinso cleared up their table and trailed after him. He was aware he wasn't in control, but it was nice, because for a moment he was able to forget the shadow of a hero that had passed through the halls without a trace. He came back to full awareness and control with a tap on his shoulder. We're here. Shinso sighed, waving absent-mindedly at the nurse's office. But the nurse isn't. Shinso seemed to relax at the familiar bitter cynicism in his voice. Izuku figured he was glad that he wasn't mad at him for using his quirk. He was a bit uneasy at how easily it could be used, but Shinso had done it with good intentions. Even if those intentions were misplaced when it came to him. I'll go find Recovery Girl, until then put pressure on your hand. Shinso sighed, massaging his temples again and glaring at Izuku. The glare paired with the eye bags made for a frightful combination. Stay here. Don't make me order you with my quirk. Izuku figured Shinso was at his mental limit for forcibly using his quirk on him for the foreseeable future, but he decided not to mention it. Yeah, I got it. I'm on timeout or whatever. Shinso sent him one last glare before leaving the room. Izuku thought he might have staked out the door for a couple minutes before leaving if he hadn't been so worried about him. It was unfamiliar to be worried about by someone other than his mother, so Izuku ignored it and left the office. Now that he was lucid again, he couldn't stop seeing All Might passing by the corners of his vision. He still admired his number one hero. But looking at him in that gaunt form made Izuku think of that day, and that was not something he ever wanted to do again, and he was in front of a faucet before he knew it. The water was running as quickly as it could. The handle had been yanked all the way up to the strongest setting. The pressure hurt his hands more, but he ignored it as he watched the water turn pink after rolling off of his palms. Shinso would be mad at him, he half thought before an alarm rang. Izuku had heard alarms a lot when he was out at night testing the limits of his quirks with criminals. But he wasn't out right now. He didn't have his switchblade. He was at UA. His face was uncovered, so anybody could recognize him. That alarm was just so loud. And the water still hadn't stopped running. Izuku was standing at the front gate. It was crumbled in a way only thousands of years of weathering or a quirk could accomplish. For a moment Izuku thought it was not the kind of quirk the press would have, and then he shook his head because if even he made assumptions like that, nothing would ever change. The press had been removed quickly, and the alarm was said to have been caused by them trespassing on campus. Izuku knew he should leave before the teachers arrived to look at their high-security gate. He did leave, eventually, wondering if the shadow that seemed to shift as he left was a trick of the light rather than anything more malicious. He had accidentally flooded the first floor's Western boys' bathroom. Apparently the sink didn't drain as quickly as it filled. Nobody blamed him for it, nobody even mentioned it to him, even though he was sure Nedsa knew it was him from his cameras. They'd probably seen him leaving in a panic and assumed he didn't need a scolding for that. They probably also assumed the panic was caused by the alarms rather than anything else. He was glad to let them keep that assumption. At the end of the day, he got off scot-free for an incident that was entirely his fault. It was a bit off to him that, in this school, water damage was secondary to student safety. But it was still a nice thought. Izuku had made it back to Class 1C after the incident, to check in with Present Mike, and then immediately left. School wasn't over immediately, since the incident was minor. There was supposed to be a class president election, but it was easy for Izuku to convince Mike to let him leave early. So Mom won't be worried, he had said. He didn't leave campus immediately though. Instead he slipped through the hallways, holding his breath like Vamp had taught him. He was still extra careful around the cameras. He didn't like being seen when he was doing things he knew were stupid. But wearing a mask while sneaking around in the halls of a hero school after a security breach, no matter how minor it had appeared, was ill-advised. Izuku couldn't get that shadow out of his head. He thought something was wrong. He almost always thought something was wrong, but he only acted upon it when he got a specific sinking feeling in his stomach. Dread directed at something invisible. When he was little he thought maybe he did have an invisible quirk, and that it was sensing danger. But now he knew differently, and even back then, he was often wrong about what was dangerous and what wasn't. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he stopped when he recognized the teacher's lounge. There was a keypad on it, and if he knew Nedzu, each teacher would have a specific code so he wouldn't be able to get in without seeming suspicious. Even if he could go unnoticed. Izuku thought that, since it was troublesome to get it to the lounge, there was probably nothing for him to find in the first place. The security breach had only lasted a couple of minutes. If the press were after anything, it would files. It would be the same for anyone else. Information was one of the most valuable things UA had, thanks to Nedzu. So he figured he needed to find a console to see if any information was stolen or deleted. Or he could just tell someone his suspicions that information had been stolen, but what if he was wrong? Or worse, what if he was right and they wondered why he knew? "Kid, why aren't you in class?" Izuku was in the wrong mode for being snuck up on, so a retort fell off of his tongue the moment he registered who it was. It was better than jumping the guy. Izuku had been really close to jumping him. "I could ask you the same thing." He snapped, and then his face colored as he regained himself and remembered he did not have a mask and he was not out at night and that he was in U.S. Sorry, that was really rude of me. He was quick to bow. Eraserhead just stared at him. "What happened to your hand?" he eventually asked, gesturing lazily at Izuku's clenched fist, which had started bleeding again from the force of his nails. It had never entirely stopped before, but the slow ooze had returned to a steady drip. "See chopsticks," Izuku replied, before realizing that that was incoherent at Eraserhead's raised eyebrow. "Chopsticks?" he repeated, and Izuku's face burned. "Why yeah?" Izuku paused for a moment before considering this opportunity to give himself an alibi. I was going to the nurse's office and got turned around. Recovery girl is out right now." Eraserhead sighed, pinching his nose to massage out his furrowed brows before unlocking the teacher's lounge with a code. Izuku would be lying if he said he hadn't made sure to memorize it. "I'll bandage your hand, come in." Oh, I couldn't." Izuku waved his hands a little to disengage himself from the situation, but all he accomplished was splattering a bit of blood across the tile. Both he and Eraserhead stared at the stains. "I'll clean that up," Izuku said quickly, and Eraserhead just sighed harder. With more feeling. "Just get inside." Izuku followed him, mostly because he didn't want to make any more messes. He was silent as Eraserhead pulled a first aid kit out of the cupboard and motioned Izuku over to the sink. He was busy pulling a variety of dirty mugs out of the basin when Izuku joined him, and Izuku moved to help before remembering his bloody hands. Eraserhead moved to start cleaning his hands, but he pulled away. I can do it myself. It's hard to wrap wounds on your hands, just let me do it." Eraserhead said it like Izuku was the picture of irrationality. He shrank a little at the tone but nodded. "Okay." Eraserhead was good at treating injuries. Izuku wondered if he learned it from treating himself or from treating others. He was almost done wrapping the second hand when Izuku spoke. Eraserhead sends dash. "Call me Aizawa-sensei. I'm a teacher before a hero on campus." He sounded so tired, and Izuku couldn't help but feel like he was wasting Aizawa's time. "Aizawa-sensei," he corrected, because swallowing his worry and spitting out his concerns about the security breach. "Did you think it was a distraction to steal information?" Aizawa's eyes sharpened as he looked up from the hand he was bandaging to inspect Izuku's face. "Why do you ask? Do you have reason to think it was?" It's mostly just speculation, and I would never normally waste your time with something like this, but it doesn't sit right with me. And no one would destroy a UA gate for an article in a gossip rag. They must have wanted something bigger. And all I could think of was information. That's pretty sharp speculation. Aizawa's eyes flashed slightly as he secured the bandage. "I'll bring it up to Nedzu if he hasn't already thought of it." Izuku dropped his head at that. He should have realized he couldn't offer anything Nedzu hadn't already. If you ever come up with any more speculations, come to me. Aizawa continued and Izuku glanced up at him. Aizawa did not elaborate. Go home, school's almost over. Izuku left the teacher's lounge as though something were nipping on his heels, but he walked slowly through the halls as though he might catch sight of something lurking there. He didn't. Where were you? Shinso grabbed him the moment he stepped through the remaining intact gate. Izuku wondered if Shinso had been waiting there for him to walk out. In the nurse's office. He lied and held out his hands, bandaged too well for Shinso to doubt someone else had done it. But I went back for you and you weren't there. Sorry about that. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck in the picture of sheepishness. His red face only added to his deception, even if it was red from the shame of lying to Shinso, who had just been trying to help, rather than embarrassment. I panicked a little and ran towards the exit. When they announced it was the press, I went to Mike-sensei to check and then went back to the nurse. Oh, Shinso exhaled in relief. Maybe next time let me know too? Just so I don't have to play any more games of one-sided hide and seek on this giant campus. Oh, I'm so sorry to have wasted your time like that. Izuku wrung his hands and Shinso looked at him with something akin to bewilderment. God, Midoriya, I'm not mad. Learn how to take a joke. Okay. He replied, and if Izuku spoke a little more quietly than usual, Shinso didn't mention it. Shoyuta was half asleep in the middle of class when Hizashi called him. He could tell it was Hizashi from the obnoxious ringtone that he didn't have the heart to change, mostly because Hizashi would be really irritating if he ever found out it was different and Shoyuta was not young enough to survive that level of stress. What? He growled into the phone, drawing a terrified look from Ojiro and maybe Hagakure. Shoyuta couldn't tell with her yet. So scary. Hizashi said through the phone, at much too loud a volume to be acceptable. Of course, Shoyuta knew his friend, so his phone was resting on his desk rather than against his ear. I'm in the middle of something, tell me what you want directly. Shoyuta sighed while dragging a hand across his face, stubble catching on his palm. It's about the phi dash. Shoyuta muted his phone. Class. Shoyuta glared at his students, already down to 19, soon to be 18 if he had his way. I'm leaving. Keep doing whatever you were doing before. And then he left. They had been doing math. You have no sense of subtlety, do you? He sighed, leaning against the hall a fair distance from one's entrance with his phone in hand. You got it. Hizashi cheered, like it was an accomplishment. Anyways, I wanted to let you know that Class 1, CS Hero Helpers Dash, Shoyuta visibly grimaced at the name, but Hizashi charged forward. We'll be helping with as rescue training as victims, so you and 13 need to give them a rundown on their duties and safety procedures. Also, those in 1D and 1E will be with 1B for hostage situation simulations and might need your help managing that. Was this important enough to interrupt Class 4? Shoyuta was already less than glad about being informed of all the extra work getting piled on him, and even then, it wasn't anything to pull him out of Class 4. Don't sound so angry. We both know you weren't teaching right now since it's time for your afternoon nap. Also, I just figured I should keep you informed since this means Midoriya Izuku will be at the USJ with you and your class. Ah. Shoyuta paused at the name. He really didn't know what to make of that boy. I guess this might be a little more interesting than I thought. He sighed, hanging up on Hizashi without a second thought. He had a barrage of texts from Hizashi by the time he returned to the classroom. The standard, that was so rude, and how could you, flashed on his screen. The almost constant stream of messages had barely calmed down by the time he got back into his yellow sleeping bag, only for another buzz to draw his attention back to his phone. I was also going to tell you about your long-lost son, but I guess now I won't. Tongue sticking out. What? Midoriya was scribbling furiously in a notebook, and Hitoshi wasn't quite sure he wanted to know what, exactly, he was writing. Hey, Midoriya, you're looking a bit manic right now. He said, tapping on Midoriya's desk for attention before pulling his hand away like he was afraid he was within biting range. Midoriya's eyes flashed with something. Was that irritation? As he looked up from his notebook. Hey, Shinso, you're looking a bit insomniatic today. I'm not okay? Hitoshi blinked very slowly. But what are you doing? I'm analyzing the weaknesses of Class 1A for their training exercise. Why? To make sure they're properly challenged. Aren't we only supposed to be acting as victims? For rescue training? He asked, and Midoriya looked at him like he was the dumbest person on the planet. Yes, but that doesn't mean I have to make it easy for them. Hitoshi heard Midoriya mutter something about hoping Kakin got stuck in the downpour zone and leaned away from him. He could talk to him later. The 1C kids who had signed up to be hero course assistants were sent outside after lunch. They were supposed to visit the USJ by bus so they could be briefed in safety protocol and their duties on site. Hitoshi ended up walking in front of Midoriya, glancing backwards every other step to make sure he didn't run into anything while his face was shoved in his notebook. It's empty? Hitoshi sighed when they arrived at a solitary bus. He thought the people from other general education classes in their subcourse, or at least the supervising teacher, would be there. He didn't think the 4 students from 1C were enough to get anything done as practice victims in disaster simulation. It's not, Midoriya replied, and Hitoshi tried his best not to be disturbed by the combination of Midoriya's ability to divide his attention and the horror movie type line. What? One of the other students asked, nervously twisting her hands and glancing around as though a ghost might pop out. Midoriya's eyes widened the moment he realized there were people other than Hitoshi around him, and he hastily put away his notebook. Strike what Hitoshi said about Midoriya dividing his attention. The teacher eye is right over there. He trailed off, pointing towards a slumped form that Hitoshi hadn't noticed, and, from his classmates' jumpy reactions, they hadn't either. It's a ghost. She squeaked, and Midoriya gave her the closest look he had to exasperation while being simultaneously terrified. Hitoshi felt a little bad, even he wasn't this cripplingly awkward around new people. And the girl couldn't really be considered new either, since he was 100% sure Midoriya had at least a 2-page spread on whatever her quirk was. It's Aizawa-sensei, he muttered, so lowly that only Hitoshi caught it. The slumped form eventually moved and ambled over to the group. The girl let out another squeak that the boy with them silenced with a head pat. You're all on time then, Aizawa said, as though he hadn't kept them waiting there for 5 minutes. And for what? Some shut-eye? To convince them campus was haunted? And you're late. Hitoshi could help but snap, hissing when Midoriya's elbow ended up in his ribs. Aizawa's gaze shifted between them, settling on Hitoshi with the look of a thoroughly disinterested and unimpressed cat. Name. All it takes to stop Hitoshi's heart is 1 syllable and 4 letters. Shinso H. Hitoshi. He replies, taking on Midoriya's stutter with a slip of the tongue. Suddenly his brain is filled with the horror stories murmured by upperclassmen about a specific teacher with a scarf and penchant for expelling students who cross him. Well, Shinso, I'll take your concerns under advisement. Aizawa says carefully, a satisfied smile slipping into his expression at the abject terror in Hitoshi's eyes. The smile is not unlike the one Midoriya gets when he's plotting something. The realization only makes Hitoshi more terrified of his friend. They pile on the bus silently, Midoriya looking both smug and concerned at Hitoshi's he doesn't even know what to call it close call, maybe? The other students give a wide berth to both the teacher and the one who has unfortunately attracted his attention. He doesn't say anything about it though, and Hitoshi doesn't know whether he's relieved or bored without the staple Midoriya snark. Midoriya is drawing something in this notebook, and when he sees Hitoshi glancing at it, he shifts his arm to give him a better view. It's the teacher, Aizawa, except he's in a hero uniform with a floating capture weapon and black jumpsuit and goggles that Hitoshi knows will be colored yellow because he knows Eraserhead. His favorite hero. The one he respects most. The person he wants to be just like. The hero he just told off. Midoriya doesn't even try to stifle his laughter. You will mostly be on setup duty since the students are new to rescue. We're going to start off with them rescuing Simbots and then let the competent ones try their hands at rescuing you guys. Aizawa yawns, nodding towards the entirety of the USA. It's huge. Hitoshi knew it was big, but there are 6 different disaster zones from ruins to floods, and each one is to scale. Midoriya looked a little disappointed at the safety measures, and Hitoshi tried not to let that get to him. He had no right to judge if his friend was an M. The disappointment disappeared quickly anyways, flying off of Midoriya's face when a round, white figure appeared in the distance. "It's 13. He said, earning a look from Aizawa and glances from everyone else within earshot. "Looks like a marshmallow." Hitoshi sighed, not having learned his lesson about being rude to UA staff. He winced at the second jab in his side of the day. Midoriya's elbow might become stuck between his ribs if he kept this up. "Yes, it's 13. Aizawa says, impossibly unenthusiastic in comparison to Midoriya's outburst, "and they will be in charge of teaching you the safety protocols and your duties." "What will you be doing, sensei?" one of the other students asks, bravely in Hitoshi's opinion. "This." Aizawa replies, pulling a yellow sleeping bag out of somewhere without hesitation. Hitoshi wishes he was surprised. He was thinking about free points. He loved and hated them. On one hand, if there were too many useless mobs to farm, the game was too easy, but on the other there was something satisfying about being able to decimate a group with a single AoE attack and watch as the EXP rolled in. He thought this would be like that. A horde of free points for him to reap the rewards of. He needed those points to level up if he was going to beat the final boss. The game he was currently playing was horribly unbalanced, to the point that he would spend hours scratching at his skin hoping for it to be patched by the moderator. The bosses were horribly unbalanced, while any other mob amounted to nothing. His character was pretty unbalanced too, if you asked him. Insane destructive ability, along with a mentor that was a deus ex machina if not anything else. And he wasn't sure he understood the plot exactly. There were too many holes. It wasn't even a good game. But, despite that, he would finish it. He had to finish it. All he knew was that he had to win this game. "Kurogyri," he said, looking away from his computer monitor and towards the mass of shadows tending the bar. It was a scene like that of any pub in any fantasy game where you could get information for gold coins. Only information was sold for yen here. He wondered how much he had spent to get enough information to finally get into UA and find that schedule. It wasn't even hard to get. It wasn't high priority to them. In fact, it had been left out on a teacher's desk, printed and easy to snatch. He thought it was ridiculous that such low-profile information had cost so much. Unbalanced. He muttered, biting his nails until blood began dripping down his fingers. "Shigaraki," Kurogyri prompted, once he realized that whatever Shigaraki was about to request was lost when his thoughts derailed. He looked up, his eyes as red as the blood on his fingers, and he searched Kurogyri's form Blanqui for anything. He only saw smoke. "I want more summons," he finally said. A dark laugh rang out, but neither of the two in the room flinched at the fact that it wasn't from them. "It will be done," the voice said, still full of mirth, and Shigaraki smiled. It was an unpleasant smile, for both him and those who saw it. His lips cracked and bled with the stretch. It stung. The blood of his nails was still in his teeth. But he smiled despite this, because here was the patch he wanted. Shigaraki Tamura hated unbalanced games. Izuku couldn't stop muttering. He had gotten to school early. Early, considering he wasn't supposed to be there for another 2 hours. He felt jittery. He thought it might be excitement to see the heroic students in action. But he also thought he might be scared. Of what? He didn't know, at least that's what he told himself, ignoring the voice repeating Deku in his ear like it was a curse and the sting in his shoulder that never fully went away. The things that came out of his mouth were incomprehensible. Even to him. The rare student or staff member that passed him gave him concerned looks that he wished he hadn't noticed. He wondered if Nedzu was watching on the cameras. He doubted that he wasn't. He decided to duck into the bathroom. He still had 30 minutes until he was supposed to meet 13 and the others to set up the simbots at the USJ. He turned on the sink, but only for the noise. The steady hiss of water drowned out his muttering quiet well, and if one saw him they might think he was mouthing song lyrics. It would have to be rap with how fast his mouth was moving, but it was still plausible. Steam started rising from the water surprisingly fast. He shouldn't have been surprised that the water heater at UA was better than the one in his house, considering the disparities between his household's budget and UA's budget, but his eyes couldn't help but widen at how hot the water had gotten. Would it feel like burning to death? The muttering stopped with that line. He should have thought of this sooner. Thinking about quirks always managed to pull him out of whatever he was stuck in. His own quirk was especially effective. He glanced at the mirror over the sink. It was foggy with condensed vapor. His face felt damp too. The water must have been really hot to produce so much steam. He decided he'd put his hand under the water, for comparison's sake. He'd figured it couldn't hurt nearly as much as being burned by fire. "What are you doing?" He jolted, his index fingers slipping under the jet of hot water before he pulled backwards. He turned towards the voice with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The burn ached. The water was the kind of hot that felt cold, and his raw skin protested as. His fingernails dug into it. "Washing my hands?" he said, with a lilt to his voice that made it seem like there was absolutely nothing abnormal about sticking your hands under scalding hot water. The expression of the boy who interrupted him didn't physically change, but Izuku got the impression that the glare intensified. It was the kind of glare that made him uncomfortable. The type that called him insignificant in 5 different ways. The glare that Bakugo had worn when he burned him. No, that wasn't it. He knew that wasn't it. He knew it because the boy's face was burned. It was a face he recognized, a face he saw the right half of from clips of One as villain and hero training exercise. A face with a distinct frame of red and white hair that he recognized from blurry childhood photos posted in gossip magazines. The photos stopped after he had turned 6. For all Izuku knew about heroes and Class 1A, he hadn't known that Endeavor's son was burned. Fire? No, the texture was wrong. He glanced at the water and turned it off. His finger was glistening with the same reddish pink as Todoroki's face. It throbbed. Sorry, you probably need the sink, alright? Izuku moved away from the sink, and all of the other sinks Todoroki could have used. Todoroki made no movement to wash his hands. Izuku thought he looked angry. His self-preservation instinct told him to leave. But his meddling instinct told him he should stay. Todoroki-kun? He waved his unburned hand, hoping to catch his gaze. Todoroki's eyes stayed fixed on him. The silence wore on, and only grew heavier. He could feel his shoulders slumping under the weight, but he thought it might be too late to leave. He should have listened to that tiny part of him that still cared if he made his life more difficult and just left. This was unbearable. Finally, Todoroki spoke, eyes drifting from Izuku's face to the hand behind his back. "You burned yourself." The tone was flat. That unnerved Izuku more than anger ever could have. "No, I didn't," he replied, and Todoroki's gaze settled back on his face. The direct eye contact made him wildly uncomfortable, but if he looked away now it would be like admitting his guilt. Why? He couldn't stop himself from raising an eyebrow at Todoroki's blatant disregard of what he said. "Why didn't I burn myself?" he asked back, feigning nonchalance despite the familiar edge entering his voice. He wanted this conversation to be over now and he'd fight to get out if he had to. He shook his head sharply. This wasn't the bad part of town. There were white tiles on the floor. Not stained cement. He didn't have to fight. He just had to walk past him. Todoroki was silent. And then he took a step forward. Izuku took a step back, tensing as though this would end in a fight. Part of his mind screamed at him to relax his posture. Looking openly hostile would encourage retribution more than standing still would. "I'll ice it," he finally said, hoping his admission would make Todoroki stop getting closer and snap himself out of the fight side of fight or flight. Todoroki ignored it and walked until he was in front of the sink. And then he froze the nozzle. Icing burns directly does more harm than good. Run your hand under cool water. And then he left. Izuku crept over to the sink slowly. The ice had melted somewhat from how hot the faucet had been from the water earlier. He turned the sink on, this time twisting the handle to cool. The water was refreshing when he ran it over his burn. Pleasantly numbing. So much so that he didn't bother resetting to get rid of the shiny burn tissue. He was in the bus on his way to the UHA by the time he bothered to wonder why Todoroki Shudo was in the school bathroom 2 hours before school started. Something was nagging at him. Something about the encounter hadn't quite sat right. Was it the way Todoroki stood? Something about the set of his jaw made him strike Izuku as a prideful boy. But his posture was the picture of grace when he stood still, But the moment he started to walk, there was a hunch hidden in the elegance that was anything but prideful. Izuku tried to focus on more specific things that stood out to him. Maybe it was how his right cheekbone was a different shade than the rest of his skin. Or maybe it was how the smudge at the corner of his mouth looked more like blood than anything else. Izuku told himself that Todoroki was just tired, that it was just a shadow across his face, that he ate toast with strawberry jam for breakfast. But a smaller, quieter part of him thought that maybe, just maybe, something was wrong with Todoroki Shudo. Izuku made some tweaks to the Simbots as he placed them in their locations. He'd run it by 13 first, citing the fact that some civilians were a bit more difficult to rescue than others. He also ran switching up which heroic students went to which zone by them. Specifically switching Todoroki and Bakugo from the conflagration zone to the downpour zone and putting Tsuyu and Uraraka in their place. He said it would be good for testing Todoroki's control of his ice and how Bakugo would combat conditions that make it hard to activate his quirk, while putting Tsuyu in the fire zone would test her reactions to harsh environments, and how Uraraka got around being unable to touch things and activate her quirk. Originally, Izuku had only wanted to make sure Bakugo got soaked and was planning to sacrifice any member of 1A he could to manipulate the groups properly. He wanted to be prepared, just in case he ran into him later. But then he saw Todoroki's name under the conflagration zone and, in a fit of misdirected empathy, manufactured an excuse to move him out of there. 13 was quick to take his suggestions under advisement, considering Izuku had proven himself able at planning exercises and went above and beyond during the debriefing he and the other helpers went through. Izuku would be lying if he said he hadn't been so attentive and helpful during training for this very opportunity, but he would also be lying if he said he wouldn't have been just as attentive and helpful without those ulterior motives. Despite his eagerness to start the activities, the hero students had yet to arrive, and Izuku was left sitting on the central plaza and gazing wistfully at the rescue zones. You could try not to look so sad that you aren't stuck in a smoldering building, Shinso says, drawing Izuku's attention away from the domed structure housing the conflagration zone. But I'm bored. I want to see the heroics. Students and analyze their quirks, but instead I'm just sitting here, 'cause we finished setting up early and they aren't here yet. When did you get so whiny? Shinso sighs, taking a seat next to Izuku as he pouts. I've always been whiny. Izuku tries not to remember those moments in middle school when he would be on the floor and his classmates would be standing over him and everything would hurt and he'd beg them to stop and they'd say, "Stop whining," and, "It's part of my charm." He smiles, squishing his cheeks as he does so to hide how strained the expression feels. Did you burn yourself setting up the Simbots in Conflag? I thought they had the fires turned off during setup. Shinso asks, and Izuku tilts his head. What? Your finger is burned. Izuku is surprised he managed to forget. Throwing himself into work as a distraction was blessedly effective. Oh, that's from this morning, he says, and Shinso doesn't ask anything else. It's all too easy to assume he simply burned himself making breakfast. They sit in silence for a while, until Izuku elbows Shinso in the side. He hadn't even said anything rude to a pro hero this time. What time is it? I don't know. Shinso replies, wanting to pull out his phone but knowing it is stowed away in the locker room. Well, check. Izuku whines, leaning against Shinso as if to dislodge him from his seat. Shinso pushes him off and Izuku slips off of his perch with a thump. Check it yourself. No, you broke my legs. Comes Izuku's muffled voice, and Shinso stifles a snort at the pile of limbs and the UA gym uniform that is almost unidentifiable as Izuku. Fine. Shinso sighs, getting up to go find 13 or one of the other 1C students. He remembers seeing watches on their wrists and wonders if he should invest in one. Especially if he's going to be stuck with the child that Izuku becomes when he's impatient about something. Class 1A arrives shortly after Shinso leaves, and Izuku watches them from a distance. None of them seem to notice him. He knows Aizawa gave him an exasperated look the moment he got into the building, at least. 13 is giving a lecture about how dangerous quirks can be, one that Izuku gave him pointers on because if anyone knew how dangerous a heroic quirk, or any quirk, could be, it was him. When panic strikes Izuku, he doesn't know the trigger. He just knows the hairs on the back of his neck stand up and it's cold and something is wrong. There's a heavy feeling in his stomach that makes it near impossible to move as he calls out to Aizawa. There's something wrong. The desperation in his voice draws not only Aizawa's gaze, but also the gaze of several students, including the fiery red glare of Bakugo. Izuku freezes when he feels the familiar gaze, and it's just long enough for him to miss the slight gust of damp air behind him. "Get out of there!" Aizawa calls, jumping down from the entrance and sprinting to the central plaza where Izuku is. Where the villains are, he realizes with a start that has him half-turning to face a horde of people that shouldn't have been there. He recognizes the looks in their eyes. He doesn't flinch when a knife digs its way into his back. He knows from the way his flesh rips that it's serrated. It misses his spine, leaving his legs mobile while completely destroying his right kidney, nicking his liver, and most likely perforating his large intestine. If he didn't die of shock or blood loss first, he'd be done in by sepsis. He doesn't really care about any of that though, he only cares about whether or not anyone saw the knife go in, other than the one who stabbed him. His angle hides it from the heroic students, but he's not sure about Aizawa. The knife twists as he's thinking, and Izuku gasps at the pain, his mind going fuzzy. He can do damage control later. Right now it's just him, and this man with a knife, and nobody can see his face because it's dark and there is blood on the graffitied brick walls that shouldn't be there. He yanks out the knife, chunks of gore coming with it, and stabs it downwards into the man's foot. He was lucky, managing to wedge the knife in between the cracks of the cement tiles on the floor. "Careful, you could hurt somebody," he hisses, head spinning and breath coming too fast and too slow as blood pours out of his back. There is a horde of villains around him by now, surrounding Aizawa and obscuring him from sight. He decides this is fine. And he lets go. The knife around his neck is covered in blood, and so is his uniform when he comes to on the hard dirt ground. He realizes it's cold when it shouldn't be before he recognizes the zone as the landslide zone. Villains are frozen along the mountainside like statues in Medusa's garden. There's only one student capable of that in Class 1A. He searches his memory for a recollection of how he got here, and finds an answer in the form of a humid portal that swept through the crowd of villains. They must have split their forces to corner students by spreading them across the USJ. They obviously didn't do their due diligence, Izuku scoffs, when he realizes they couldn't have placed Todoroki in an area with good visibility and poor cover that let him freeze everything in sight on purpose. The back of his neck aches, and he knows he reset at some point because the burn on his finger has faded. There is screaming in the distance, and Izuku can't pinpoint a direction between the ringing of his ears and the echoing cries. He wonders if people are dying. And then he dismisses that thought. He's the only person who would be killed by a half-butted invasion like this. At least, that's what he thinks before he catches sight of the flood zone, and the students stranded on a boat with villains surrounding them in the water. He sees Shinsu's purple hair on that boat. And something tells him his friend can't swim. The thought moves him despite the way every part of his body protests and tries to lull him into taking a nap on the floor and not moving for a very long time. He needs the electric boy Kaminari, or the creation girl. He'd even take Uraraka, the gravity girl, at this rate. He could work something out with any of them. Although his best option would have to be Todoroki. His eyes dart across the iced landscape with the glittering statues. The level of frostbite on the villains makes Izuku think Todoroki is long gone. But then he hears a low voice and the unmistakable sound of someone choking on their own terror. At first he has the wild thought that Todoroki has been captured, and then he's greeted with the sight of a trembling villain with an enraged Todoroki standing nose to nose with him, and for a moment, looking at Todoroki's expression and the expression of the villain, Izuku forgets who the enemy is. They want to kill the symbol of peace. That's all I know. The man pleads and Todoroki scoffs. Like I'll believe that. Todoroki scoffs, raising a hand, and Izuku doesn't think that Todoroki is going to freeze him solid, leaving him to suffocate in an icy prison, but he grabs Todoroki's wrist anyways. Todoroki's temperature drops under his grip and he yanks his arm away, the frost that formed the moment Izuku touched him ripping off a layer of his skin as Todoroki's foot plants itself in the ground and he summons a glacier to freeze Izuku in place. Izuku almost doesn't dodge. The pain slows his reaction time, and all he can think is that he's never been frozen to death before, so it might be good to write down the effects in his journal when he gets home. He rolls out of the way at the last second and writes himself, trying not to flinch at the way his uniform, wet with what should be mostly his blood, but he doesn't really remember, leaves red streaks across the dirt. "Todoroki!" he calls, slightly panicked that he'll end up a popsicle and be put out of commission for the rest of the fight if he can't get him to recognize him as the student from this morning. Todoroki pauses for a moment, taking in the bloody gym uniform and green hair. He looks confused, but it's hard to tell what about his expression conveys that. "You?" he finally says, and Izuku realizes he doesn't even know his name. He wanted to laugh at that. He really did. An only vaguely hysterical half snort, half whine leaves his mouth as his nods. "Me." Todoroki nods at the response, relaxing his guard just enough as to not appear hostile towards Izuku. His foot is still firmly planted on the ground, and Izuku knows he is ready to freeze him the moment he does anything suspicious. Now that introductions are over, Izuku starts before Todoroki can say anything about anything, pointing in the direction of the flood zone. "Please freeze that lake for me." The fight passed by in a blur, but the one thing Shoyuta distinctly remembered among the blood and the flashes of his gray scarf and the villain's dying quirks was Midoriya Izuku's face. The kid had looked panicked, even before the portal opened up, spilling villains into the USJ, but the moment the tall villain with pointed teeth appeared behind him, something changed. Shoyuta recognized the way his face hardened. It was something he saw on Pro Heroes when they realized an encounter would become a full-blown battle. And Shoyuta could not understand why that expression made its way onto the quirkless boy's face. The second time the expression shifted, it was wilder. It was something that Shoyuta wished he hadn't seen. Midoriya pulled a bloodied knife out of somewhere, and the battle-worn expression fell off his face, replaced by something feral as he turned and stabbed the knife through the villain's foot and into the ground. He was smiling while he did it. Shoyuta wasn't built for group battles. His eyes stung easily, quickly beginning to burn with prolonged quirk use, and shifting his gaze between opponents was something that required perfect timing. Luckily he had trained for this. What he had not trained for was fighting alongside the force of nature that was Midoriya. The kid danced through the battlefield around Shoyuta, never close enough for him to grab and pull out of danger. His movements were almost violent. Sometimes the way he swung his arm made Shoyuta think he had dislocated his shoulder with the force of it, and he was covered in blood Shoyuta hoped to God wasn't his. He aimed for all the sensitive spots. Going for the throat, jamming his thumbs into eyes and his knees into crotches. He was the kind of person that fought dirty, using everything he could reach to his advantage. Shoyuta swore he saw a metal projectile, the product of a quirk, rip through Midoriya's chest before planting itself into the ground. But the boy did not stop. He thought he must have seen that wrong, and strained to catch another glimpse of Midoriya, but his vision was quickly obscured by his own opponents, who he sent sprawling across the ground with a flick of his wrist and his capture scarf. He found himself without ally on the battlefield the next time he had a moment to look up, and he didn't know where Midoriya had gone, but he hoped it was safer than here. He was loath to admit that he was only able to endure this group battle so well because of one of the students he was supposed to protect. Aizawa is holding off the horde of villains in the central plaza surprisingly well when Izuku and Todoroki pass him by, skirting the edges of the battlefield, to get to the lake. Todoroki hadn't made any motion to question why Izuku wanted him to freeze the lake, and Izuku thought that it was odd that Todoroki seemed to have no interest in what he was being used for, resolving himself to do it without explanation. Then again, Izuku supposed he probably noticed the dire straits of the classmates on the boat and figured out the reason behind Izuku's request with relative ease. If you just freeze the surface of the lake, the villains should get stuck for long enough to evacuate the students on the boat. Izuku didn't bother naming them. He had an inkling that Todoroki wouldn't be able to match the names to the faces even if he did. He glanced at Todoroki out of the corner of his eye. The sheen of frost on his cheek had thinned on the trek here, but his breath was still visible. "Are you too cold to do it?" Izuku asked, and Todoroki shook his head with an uncharacteristic violence that dislodged some of the frost coating from his hair and sent it drifting to the ground like snow. It didn't do much to convince Izuku, but he thought he should trust Todoroki to know his own limits. But as he waited, Todoroki didn't move to freeze the lake. "Is there something wrong?" Izuku asked, and Todoroki stood silently for too long before finally opening his mouth. "Won't the people under the ice drown?" Izuku blinked. He hadn't thought of that. But, based on what he had seen of Todoroki, he wouldn't have expected him to think of it either. "Does that matter?" he asked, and Todoroki looked at him for a solid 30 seconds before nodding. "Yes." Izuku felt foolish for thinking that Todoroki was going to freeze that villain to death earlier and trying to stop him. He was a hero in training, no matter how cold he seemed. Izuku looked away. "Okay, then I'll get them to come to the surface first." He jumped into the lake before Todoroki could even think of stopping him. Shudo watched as a cloud of blood rose to the surface from the spot the boy dived in. He wondered what he had been doing to end up so soaked in it. It couldn't have been only his blood, he wouldn't be standing if it was. Shudo pushed his questions out of his head and squatted next to the pond, watching for a sign of the boy or any submerged villains. He had one job to do, and he would do it right. His breath shuddered in his lungs as he tried to dislodge the frost settling there. He called upon his left as much as he could without igniting, but the warmth he felt from it was fleeting. He was almost glad when the numbing cold that had been spreading from his right side to his left wasn't pushed back by the weak heat he allowed himself to radiate. He was freezing, but that felt more like a victory than anything else. The villains that weren't focused on climbing or sinking the boat that the UA students were stranded upon were quick to notice Izuku. Fish were always sensitive to blood in the water. Izuku wasn't the strongest swimmer, but he was able enough to lure the few villains to the surface by sacrificing his right leg to their shark-like teeth. He ended up frozen in the middle of the lake with the rest of them in an instant. He knew it wasn't the time, but he couldn't help but marvel at the speed, range, and output of Todoroki's ice. Everything below his chest was suspended in the rapidly cooling water. He could feel like right foot numbing, toes cold in a way he knew wasn't from the layer of ice over the water. He ignored it. Cold was surprisingly relieving to him. He truly thought freezing to death might be one of the most pleasant ways to go. He should find a villain with an ice quirk sometime. Izuku laid his head on his arms, waiting for someone to come free him while he let his mind wander. He found himself snapping out of his muttering session when White Boots stopped at eye level. His gaze traveled upward to find Todoroki looking down at him. And how natural that position seemed to be for the both of them. "You did it," Todoroki stated, but it seemed like he was mostly asking if Izuku was sure all the villains had their heads above water when he froze the lake. "Yeah," Izuku replied, and Todoroki kneeled to begin thawing the ice around Izuku. "I'm fine, thanks for asking," he added before he could stop himself. "I didn't ask," Todoroki replied, and he had the gall to look confused, something Izuku huffed at as he dragged himself onto the ice, wincing the moment air mingled with the ripped skin of his leg. "Let's go get Shinso, Satokuin, and Tsuchan then," he says, quickly getting up and hoping Todoroki won't notice the way the ice under his feet is being stained pink. "Who?" Todoroki asks, and Izuku can't help the frown that works its way across his face. For once he finds himself agreeing with Monoma's crazed lunchtime rants about how self-absorbed these 1A students seem to be. "I hate it here," Shinso mutters, hair damp and falling around his face, unable to continue defying gravity due to the newfound weight of water as he and the rest climb down the side of the boat to cautiously walk across the ice. "Stop whining," Izuku mutters, his own damp hair sticking to his cheeks. He's at least glad the water got rid of some of the blood and darkened his uniform enough to obscure the remaining stains. "Shinso won't freak out this way. Now, as long as nobody looks at his leg." "You're bleeding, Karo," Tsuyu says, and Izuku resists the strong urge he gets to dive back into the lake and just drown. He could do it too. There is still an access point from when Todoroki unfroze him. "It's just a scratch," he says, thankful that his uniform pants didn't get caught in the crossfire between his leg and teeth and are still long enough to obscure most of the damage. "That's a lot of blood for a scratch," she says simply, and Izuku glares at the icy ground so he doesn't turn his expression on her. Satu offers to take a look at it, and Izuku finds that he is surprisingly gentle for his quirk and size, but Izuku declines with a smile, Ignoring the suspicious looks literally everyone else in the group send his way, even Todoroki's eyes drift to his leg and his brow furrows just enough for Izuku to know he's recalling the moment when he said, "I'm fine," and wondering whether or not that was a lie. The attention is taken off of Izuku rather quickly when the students realize what looked like a fight in Aizawa's favor has quickly turned into a one-sided slaughter. A black monster stands with its hand on Aizawa's head, smashing him into the ground as a puddle of blood grows on the cracked concrete, splattering further every time Aizawa's head is brought down. Aizawa's elbow is exposed, and the skin is missing, something Izuku realizes with a start as he recognizes the muscles with white bone peeking through in his teacher's arm. The entire group's attention is so trained upon Aizawa that only Izuku notices when a blue-haired man covered in hands darts over to them, reaching a hand out for Todoroki's face. Izuku is quick to push him out of the way. He loses his footing surprisingly easily and the man's hand closes around Izuku's wrist. At first it hurts so much that Izuku has to bite his tongue to keep from screaming, and then there is nothing. No pain. He can't feel his wrist or his hand at all. He destroyed the nerves. Izuku mutters, eyes widening as he tries to piece together this man's quirk. It's the same one that stripped the skin off of Aizawa's elbow. He's sure of that at least. The image of a crumpled gate flashes in his mind and Izuku thinks, if this quirk works on both organic and inorganic material, they've found the one behind the security breach. Oh boo, and here I thought I'd get an achievement for adding another scar to the pretty boy's face. The man says, with an almost exaggerated pout under the hand on his face. His lips crack under the strain of the expression, but I guess there will be an achievement for collecting another hand dash. Izuku notices that the degradation of his hand has stopped before the man does too, caught up in his talk of achievements to look, and takes that moment to slam his intact hand into the man's throat. The others were too stunned to move up until this point, but Todoroki takes the opportunity to freeze the man's feet to the cement. He's still on the ground, shivering when he does it, and Izuku knows he's reached his limit. The man gasps for a breath to call for reinforcements not finding it as Izuku grabs one of his fingers with the assurance that Aizawa is watching and bends it backwards harshly enough to hear a crack and wrench his wrecked wrist from the man's grasp. He yanks his sleeve over it quickly, hiding the damage from the others. This way they won't be surprised if the skin is back before the end of the battle. Looking at the black monster, he expects it will be. If everything goes his way, they won't notice he was hurt in the first place. Izuku moves quickly, ripping Shinsu's sleeve before he can protest and stuffing it in the man's mouth, tying his hands the best he can with the remainder before shoving him to the ground. Don't let him escape, and if he does, don't let him touch you. He instructs, and Shinso looks ready to have a conniption, but Izuku doesn't let him speak. I'm getting Aizawa-sensei. Everyone's gazes travel towards the black monster, now sitting contently on Aizawa's back, and then back to Izuku. Tsuyu is about to protest, and Todoroki looks like he would have frozen Izuku in place long ago if he hadn't been half frozen himself, but Izuku dashes off before they can move. Tsuyu could bring him back with her tongue, but something tells her she shouldn't. So when he said he would teach me how to spar, he wasn't kidding. Shinso mutters, and the gazes of 3-1A students flicker to him for half a second, but he doesn't look away from Izuku. He thinks that he might disappear if his eyes stray from him for even a moment. Izuku doesn't know how he's supposed to fight the monster that destroyed Aizawa with such ease. He thinks it should be slow, based on its strength and muscle mass, but his thoughts were completely upended when it swats him away with insane agility the moment he gets close. He feels his ribs snap as he slams into the ground and skids, and takes the opportunity to reach for his necklace to reset, but finding it missing. That might be an issue. Kill him, Numo. An insane voice screeches and Izuku coughs out blood, both from his lungs and from the tongue he bit earlier. He doesn't breathe, the fiery pain in his side spiking the moment he even thinks of such a movement. He manages a glance in Shinsu's direction, finding the man has managed to spit out the rag despite still being tied up on the ground, before the Numu is on him, smacking him to the side like a rag doll. The Numu has no form as it fights, no D-spin as it swats and punches and drags. Izuku can barely move from his injuries, but that's fine. He might not have to reset himself, at this rate. The job is being done perfectly well for him. He lets himself be flung around for a while, ignoring the yells of his classmates as his vision flashes black and then white. "Almost there," he says, smiling bloodily, even though the Numu gives no impression of being able to understand him. It moves to toss him again, but something wraps around his ankle, his bad one, and he's yanked backwards. Everything is blurry as he's dragged across the ground, but something glints in the corner of his vision, and he realizes it's the sharpened projectile that he was shot with earlier. His grin widens as he snatches it, drawing it across his throat, thankful when the world fades almost immediately from view. He sits up next to Tsuyu, realizing she's the one who tried to bring him back. The man is still on the floor, screeching incomprehensibly, the louder, more insane version of Izuku's mumbling. The black shadow that Izuku caught glimpses of throughout the past hour materializes next to him, moving him further away from the group and untying him, much to Izuku's displeasure. But they are too focused on their conversation to approach Izuku and the others, and the Numu has stopped, believing its job to be done. "I thought you were dead," Shinso hisses, looking hysterical with his hands bunched in his damp hair, pulling it in different directions. Tsuyu is crying, Sata's hand is over his mouth, Todoroki's face is slackened in something akin to shocked horror, and Izuku wonders why. He understands Shinso's distress, barely, but they don't even know him. Why are they looking at him like that? "I'm fine," he says, voice hoarse as the words scrape out of his raw throat. He can't think of a spot on him that doesn't ache or burn, but pain hinders his movements less than shattered bones ever could. He gets back up, and Shinso tries to pull him back down, but he shrugs him off with surprising firmness. "Sadako-in, go with Tsuyu-chan and get Aizawa-sensei. Shinso, take Todoroki." His movements are dulled, but he manages to exhale everything in his lungs and escape their panicked gazes. He thanks Vamp, not for the first time, for teaching him such a technique. They all start at his disappearance, but spring into action, at least, Tsu and Sata do. Todoroki decides to try to stand without Shinso's help, stumbling on unsteady legs relatively quickly. Izuku catches some of the shadow and the man's conversation. "We need to leave Shigaraki, one of the students got out and is going for reinforcements, and," there is a hesitant pause, "you aren't in the best shape either." "It doesn't matter," the man, Shigaraki, snarls, "as long as I have 1 HP left I'm fine. We need to kill enough mobs to get the final boss to appear." His eyes travel across the destroyed central plaza, narrowing when he doesn't find what he's looking for. "I need the green one. He has a cheat. He's not what a mob should be." The shadow also looks up at that, not finding anything despite Izuku walking across the plaza, grabbing a knife from the ground as he goes. The Numu is stationary, stopped exactly where it had been when Izuku was snatched away. He supposes it's because it fulfilled its orders in some way. Izuku had died as a result of its attack, even if it didn't land the final blow. Its brain is exposed, which Izuku thinks is a huge design flaw. It may not be an intelligent being, but it has to have a central nervous system. And if it has that, it can be paralyzed. He doesn't think as he scales the beast, wrapping his legs around its neck as it violently shudders to try to throw him off, and digging the knife as far into its brain as he can manage. He twists the knife as the Numu attempts to grab at him, ripping more than slicing as he tries to sever whatever vital area that will put the monster down. He does, eventually. Izuku hears the telltale shriek of Shigaraki as the Numu collapses, rolling forwards as its body hits the floor and finally manages to dislodge him. He celebrates his victory too soon, having thought it was some sort of mutant quirk and not considering regenerative abilities. That's why he doesn't expect its giant hand to grab him around the waist, snapping his spine and rendering his legs useless. This Numa has a terribly interesting quirk, and Izuku can't help but wonder if it's similar to his own. He's noticed it takes longer and longer for him to die of serious injuries as he's explored the possibilities of his quirk. He wonders if this Numu is an example of what lies at the end of the road for him. The Numu's grip tightens, and he can't even gasp as he is crushed. He wishes he had his notebook. Toshinori Yagi thought he might be too late. He'd run out of time as All Might that morning, and ended up sulking in Nedzu's office in his shame. The tea had been good, but he'd grown restless quickly, telling the principal he was going to go on a walk and leaving. He didn't notice he was on the path leading to the USJ until one of the Ida's sons ran into him. He was suspicious at first, since Yagi wasn't in All Might form, but he was quick to trust him when he showed him his staff ID. What the boy had to say left him panicked, but he didn't show it. His smile stayed on his face as he told the Ida boy to get the rest of the staff and sent an alert to Nedzu on his phone. He anxiously waited for Ida to run out of sight before inhaling as much as he could, nearly tripling his size before racing towards the... He had students to save. He had one student to save, Yagi realized the moment he burst through the USJ doors. Unconscious villains littered the floor, and he could hear yelling and explosions from some of the disaster zones, but none of the students seemed terribly injured. In fact, the teachers seemed worse for the wear, with 13's broken suit being patched up by Yaoyorozu and Siro while a purple-haired boy he didn't recognize, Satu, Suyu, Kaminari, and Jiru were fretting over Aizawa with medical supplies that must have been supplied by Yaoyorozu's creation quirk. Enji's son was sitting on the ground with an expression that was somehow more vacant than usual. Yagi couldn't help but wince at that, not knowing why his friend's son seemed so detached from everything. Maybe he should ask Enji about it. But all of this was information to be registered in passing, as he took in the sight of a familiar green-haired boy being crushed in a black monster's grip. The smile fell off of his face. Katsuki felt the familiar burn of bile in his throat as he surveyed the central plaza with shitty hair. Of course that boy was there. He always seemed to be exactly where he shouldn't, and Katsuki couldn't stop weak sparks from igniting on his palms. He had been dropped in the downpour zone, which rendered his nitroglycerin dilute, and he was sad. He was angry that his quirk wasn't listening to him, he was irritated by the way his wet outfit chafed his skin, he was annoyed by the imbalance of only having one gauntlet, and most of all, he was furious with the fact that Midoriya Izuku was fighting an impossible creature to the death. Katsuki wished he could have missed the movement the boy made when Frog Face finally saw fit to intervene in the one-sided beating. He didn't miss it though, the arm shooting out too quickly for the way it was bent and latching onto a metal spike embedded into the ground. He could swear he could hear cicadas as he shoved Kirishima, taking his attention off of the boy, and tried not to stare at the streak of blood left by the body. Katsuki told himself the corpse was temporary as he pointed towards Kurogiri. Listen up, shitty hair, we need to get the warp BSRD so they can't escape, alright? Kirishima glanced at him, then back to where Midoriya was. Katsuki followed his gaze. Midoriya was already sitting up, covered in blood, and Katsuki had to look away. Dude, what about him? He'll die. That shitty nerd can't die. Katsuki huffed, knowing the honesty would be lost on shitty hair. After all, nobody had ever heard of a quirk like that. I really don't think it's a good idea to leave him, Kirishima started, but the words died in his throat when he caught sight of Midoriya clinging to the monster's back, digging a knife into its exposed brain like he hadn't spent the last 6 minutes being beaten to death. We'd only get in his way. Katsuki spat, and those words burned more than the bile lining his throat. Come. He dragged Kirishima towards Kurogiri, and this time he didn't protest. Katsuki manages to grab the mental brace at the center of the shadow's body at the same time the Numu collapses. The man the shadow was standing over shrieks, but Katsuki can't be sure if it's at the loss of the Numu or Kurogiri's immobilization. He lunges, but his movements are clumsy, and the fingers of the hand reaching for Katsuki are bent. Katsuki trips him with a scoff, planting his foot on his back as he continues to curse and whine about cheats and bad game mechanics. Shut the F up, moisturizer. He hisses, digging his heel into the man's back and earning more hissed curses. He shrugs them off, satisfying himself by grinding his boot to shut the man up and letting small explosions pop against Kurogiri's armor, more as a warning than anything else. Kirishima is staring at him with wide eyes, but Katsuki ignores him, glare turning towards where he last saw Midoriya. The sight he's greeted with isn't what he expected. The Numu is up, frothing at the mouth as it squeezes Midoriya in its hand. There is blood dribbling down his chin, mixing with spit and all of the other dark stains on his skin and clothes. And he's smiling, teeth red and eyes wild open too wide with the force the Numu is crushing him with. Did I do that? Katsuki asks himself, wondering if he's the reason behind that fed-up expression on the face of who was first his friend and then his victim. What? Kirishima asks, turning to look towards Midoriya, but Katsuki stops him. Hold warp BSTRD for me. It's only when he's about to hand off Kurogiri that he feels a burn in his ankle and yelps. Not yelps. Bakugo. Katsuki does not yelp, instinctively kicking his foot out and grinning when he feels it catch on a finger, snapping it if the yelp. This BSTRD is definitely the type to yelp. From the man below him is anything to judge by. The man rolls away from him, and Katsuki curses in earnest when he realizes he lost his grip on Kurogiri and that the BSTRD took the opportunity to warp both him and the crusty man away. He stumbles when he tries to shift his weight to his foot, and Shitty Hair tries to catch him but he shoves him off, sitting down hard on the floor. His boot is missing the section around his ankle, and the top part has slid down to obscure his exposed skin. He slides it up carefully, trying to keep a straight face when the rough material of his shoe brushes against his injured ankle. He realizes why it hurts so much when he sees that the skin around his ankle is gone and that some muscle went with it. What the F dash? He mutters, his voice the softest it's been since they arrived at the U. Kirishima barely catches it, glancing over in concern. Bro, your ankle, he says as though Katsuki somehow didn't notice. It's nothing. Katsuki growls, getting up unsteadily before limping a little to test his motion. This is fine, he can still move if he needs to. And when he glances at Midoriya, he decides he needs to. All Might and Bakugo arrive at Izuku at the same time, and Izuku definitely doesn't know how he feels about that, so he lets out a weak laugh that morphs into a shuddering, bloody cough as he is wrenched out of the Numu's grip too roughly. He can tell it's Bakugo that grabbed him by the too warm hand on his wrist and the way his shoulder dislocates as his arm is yanked. Izuku had lost the grip on his knife when the Numu grabbed him, and it's been kicked around by the scuffle. Kaken, he rasps, trying to force the words out of his throat, the knife. Bakugo understands him immediately, and is about to protest when he realizes Izuku will die anyways, and dragging it out will only hurt more. Don't tell me what to do. Bakugo hisses, but it lacks fire. Izuku deliriously wonders if that's because he's soaked to the bone, if that even his tone is dampened by the rain, and not just his quirk. He gets the knife quickly, handing it to Izuku, who can't sit up as he angles the knife for a clean death, as clean as he can get, considering his current state. Bakugo leans over him, as though he's checking his injuries. Both of them are uncomfortable by the proximity, but they need to make sure any eyes that may have strayed away from the Numu and All Might's fight don't land on what Izuku is about to do. Izuku does it quickly, a smooth in and out motion that causes blood to splatter across Bakugo's face. He's up in less than a minute, and Bakugo looks distinctly pale. Izuku ignores it, immediately standing and surveying All Might's fight. Both Kurogiri and Shigaraki have intervened at this point, supporting the Numu that seems to have slowed a bit since Izuku first fought it. Izuku likes to think he's responsible for that, but he knows he probably didn't accomplish much of anything other than dying throughout this entire trip. Where do you think you're going? Bakugo's hand is on his wrist before he can move, and he's frozen. To help dash, he tries to choke out, but Bakugo is faster. I think the F not. Bakugo explodes, and Izuku can feel the hand growing warmer as his breaths start to come a little faster, a little more erratically. It makes him lightheaded, and his brain was already slow due to the pain accompanying every movement he made. He has a wild thought to cut his arm off, just so Bakugo won't be touching him anymore. So he can't burn him. Let go. Maybe it was the panic on his voice, or the way he was gripping the knife, but Bakugo complied instantly. Without a word. Not even a growl. He left before Bakugo could do anything else, scrambling towards All Might, who was split in two by portals, as the Numu was digging into his side. His bad side. Izuku could see steam rising off of him, and more than anything, he wanted to avoid seeing All Might in his weakened form. He needed to help, but his mind was blank as he surveyed the scene. It was hard for him to move, let alone think as he realized, with a startling clarity, that All Might was dying and that he couldn't come back like Izuku could. In the multiple experiences he had with tackling Numu, he knew that tackling Numu always ended poorly for him. So he did it again. He targeted the brain, which he knew was effective, even if only temporarily, but this time he didn't use the knife. Instead he plunged his hands into the Numu's exposed skull and ripped out the brain. In its entirety. He flung it to the ground and stomped on it, splattering his leg with gray matter and enraging Shigaraki further. "You cheat!" He heard Shigaraki scream, and All Might slipped out of the portal now that the Numu was limp as a new portal formed in front of Izuku's face, a hand reaching through it to grab at him, to dissolve him into nothingness. Izuku knew he wasn't fast enough to dodge right now, but he was more concerned with how many fingers he could take from the man before he dissolved completely when a shot rang out, flying past his ear and piercing Shigaraki's hand before he could swing his knife. He recognized them as Snipe's bullets immediately, and had the thought to be grateful for the intervention as the knife slipped out of his admittedly poor grip. He glanced down at his fingers, which refused to make a fist, and the chipped knife on the floor and sighed. Vamp would have his head for this. Hitoshi could not take his eyes off of Midoriya. His friend was standing next to him, absolutely soaked in blood, and his outfit was ripped in more places than not, but he was insisting he was fine. He was walking and talking like he was fine too, albeit a little slower than usual. Hitoshi could attribute that to exhaustion though, because who wouldn't be exhausted after being attacked during a field trip then thrown around by an unidentifiable monster? Honestly, he was considering ripping off the boy's shirt to check for injuries, especially when he said he didn't need to visit Recovery Girl, just the shower. The boy, who he eventually recognized as Endeavor's son, that he had had to brainwash into letting him help, was also giving Midoriya suspicious looks that only made Hitoshi more worried about all the shit he'd gotten into while he wasn't looking. He thought maybe he should ask Todoroki what Midoriya had been doing while they were together, or how they met. He'd left Midoriya in the central plaza before everything went to shit, and he hated to think that Midoriya had stayed there with the villains. "Yo," Hitoshi whispered, lightly elbowing Todoroki to get his attention, but the way he drew in a